Hi, welcome to this new SimplyMaya tutorial. In this tutorial we're going to be taking a look at VRay to take this simple grey room we have in front of us here, which is your bog standard Lambert material, into something that looks a bit more like this. Now this one is mental ray, but we'll get a similar result. We'll probably get slightly nicer global illumination with VRay, as I personally think that it does a slightly nicer global illumination. And we'll be looking at, VRay settings for anti-aliasing, color control, quality control. We'll be looking at how to get a linear image out of Maya so we can correct it within Photoshop or After Effects or Nuke or whatever package is your preference. We'll be looking at VRay materials and VRay lights. So this is kind of a crash course on how to go from this to something a bit more like this in one tutorial. Now my preference for teaching is to not sit and read the manual out at you. I'd rather show by example. So we're going to start off by setting up a correct workflow so we can get a linear image out of VRay, but a gamma corrected image within Maya. Now I'll explain that as we go along, why those two things are important, but for right now let's just take a quick render of this with the standard Maya renderer so we have something for comparison. So I'm just going to hit render and you'll notice this opens up in Maya's render view. Now at the moment, if I was using mental ray, I would put a lens shader on the camera to gamma correct this image so it's proper, because at the moment this is a linear image, and when I would load this into Photoshop I would apply a gamma correction to it. If we're using Maya 2015, we can apply the gamma correction up here. So the correct gamma for this image would be 2.2, so it should actually be this bright. Now you can see why that would be important when you're lighting, because you're going to have to put fairly intense lights in here to light this up when it's indeed already been lit up. And I'll explain this in a bit more depth now. I just wanted to show you what happens when you render with Maya, and the fact that Maya 2015 now has a gamma correction up here for the render view, which is really nice. So I'm going to switch us to VRay now before we go any further. So I'm going to come down here and select VRay from the render using, and if you're not seeing that, you may need to load the VRay plugin. So if you go up to Settings and Preferences, Plugin Manager, and just scroll down until you find VRay, which should be around here, VRay for Maya. Make sure it's loaded. As soon as that's done, you'll be able to see the plugin up here. Now let's hit render with VRay, and a couple of interesting things will happen. One, you'll see it's flipped from the Maya render view to the VRay frame buffer, and two, you'll see it comes in that much lightened state. So if I take a look at the Maya one side by side, you'll see this one is much darker and this one is much lighter. But if we gamma correct this one, they're about the same brightness. Okay, VRay's a little bit brighter, but that's just because of the difference in render engines. Now if we look down here in the VRay frame buffer, you'll see it's got a little button here that says display colors in sRGB space. So if I untick that and set this back to 1, you'll see they both go a bit darker. So what we want is, when we save the image out of Maya, we want to save this image in a 16 or 32-bit format, and then we want to do the gamma and color corrections within a separate package. Trying to gamma and color correct directly within a 3D package is kind of like trying to paint in the dark. You've got so much more control in a post-processing app, even Photoshop, than you will have within here, that my preferred technique is to set up a proper linear workflow, gamma correct the render view regardless of which one you use, and then save the linear image out and recorrect later on. So let's do a setup for that. Now we could just use the VRay frame buffer and make sure that this display colors in sRGB space is ticked, but to be honest with you, I don't really use any of the features of the VRay frame buffer. So I prefer to use the Maya render view because I'm more used to it, and I'm probably guessing that most of you are too. So you can use this one by all means. You've got your basic render image and stop, and you can move your mouse down here and it will give you white balance corrections, HLS corrections and whatnot. But these are not really things I use, and as I said, I'm more comfortable personally in the straight Maya view. Now, the VRay frame buffer comes in handy for looking at render passes, so I occasionally use it for that, and we will go into that later on, but for my day-to-day rendering, I prefer to use this one. So in order to achieve this, what we'll need to do is click up, and you'll see in Maya 2015, I can just keep this at 2.2, and that will gamma correct this view, which is the correct way to do it. Or with VRay, you can come under VRay Common, under the render settings, scroll down, and here you've got use VRay frame buffer. Now, I don't want to use that right now, so I'm going to tick that, and I'm going to click Convert Image to sRGB for Render View, which will basically do what this button does. Okay, so if I set this back to 1 and take a snapshot of this, and then hit render, you'll see this will render in the render view with VRay with that sRGB conversion on. Now, I'm going to show you quite a demonstrative example of why this is so important to convert this view to a gamma of 2.2. So let's untick this for now, and let's get a shot with a light in it. So I'm going to put all this furniture on a display layer just so I can hide it. So let's come in, and I'm just going to control select pretty much the furniture, and I'm just doing this because it will give me a faster render. So I'm going to come over to the channel layer editor box, and under display layers I'm going to click this button, which will create a new layer and add everything that I've got selected into it. Okay, so I'm just going to call this room bits, bots, doesn't really matter, just as long as you know what it is. And it's handy also if you're working in a pipeline, that when you hand the file over to somebody else, they don't see, you know, layer 1, layer 2, layer 3. It's nice for other people if you put some sort of description in there. Okay, so I've missed a bit here. I've actually managed to leave the bed behind, but that's okay. If we select the bed now, just come over here and right click. We can just go add selected objects, and that will add it to this layer. Okay, so now I've got a pretty empty room that I can start to do some render tests with. And to be honest, I'd quite like to get these back doors back, just so when we shine lights in, we can kind of see the shadow pattern. So what I can do is make sure this is selected and subtract, and remove this object from this layer. So now when I hide, actually, let's see, remove selected objects. Okay, that's not coming out for some reason. Let's just try that again. There we go. Alright, so just because I wanted to select the whole group there, not just the one piece of geometry. But, you know, you should find that fairly simple. Select something, add the object, or remove it. Okay, just a little conniption there. Okay, so now we've got this kind of big empty room. I'm going to put a VRay light in here. So I'm going to go create lights. And for this, I'll use a VRay rectangular light. It doesn't really matter so much for this demonstration. And let's just take this light, and I'm going to go to the attribute editor, and I'm just going to go under the VRay light shape, and I'm going to make the U size and the V size bigger. In fact, I think I'll make these much bigger. And the arrow on the light is obviously the direction that the light will be pointing in. So right now we just need this very simplistic light. I'm going to push over here and just spin it round. So I get the direction pointing towards us. And then I'm going to do a couple of renders. One will have a gamma correction on this view, and one will not. And I think you'll see why it comes in handy. So let's try a render in VRay and see what we get. Okay, so you can see exactly what I expected to happen. We've got an insanely intensely bright hotspot here, but it's not actually lighting a lot up. This is very dark back here, and because we do not have this convert image to sRGB for render view, what's happening to us now is This is in linear space, which is fine for the image that we want to get out at the end of the day, because we'll correct it in a third-party package. We'll increase the gamma in Photoshop. But for rendering purposes, you know, if I wanted this room brightly lit now, I'd have to come up here and put the intensity from 30 to 60, so twice the intensity, and then I'd render again, and you'll see I'll get an even bigger insane hotspot, and the room here it's still not that brightly lit towards the back. And this is all because of this gamma is at 1. This is all because this image is displaying in a linear fashion. And what we want it to do is display in a gamma corrected fashion. So if I just throw this down to 30, which is where we started at, and hit render, you'll see here that, you know, it's the same again. The room's not bright enough, the hotspot's too big. The gradation between the bright hotspot and the dark is just not pronounced enough. But if I change the gamma to 2.2, where it should be, you'll see this room is now brightly lit. My hotspot is not so obvious, although it is still a hotspot, and the gradation is much better. So what happens if you're not using a gamma corrected view is simply that your values for your lighting will be far too high. So your dark shadows will be entirely too dark, and your bright points will be entirely too bright, and this makes your image extremely difficult to light correctly. So, you know, the first thing you're going to want to do when you come into pretty much any setup, if you're using the Maya render view, is make sure this convert image for sRGB is ticked. You're also going to want to, if you're using the VRay frame buffer, make sure that this image, this little button image thing here that displays colors in sRGB space, is ticked. Okay, now we want a few other settings before we get going, so let's just take a look through a few of these tabs. Now, first things first, I'm going to render in HD 720. So if I select that, I still don't really get in the Maya viewport an accurate picture of where my render is actually going to happen. Because if we get this to a point, say, where the bottom of the door frame is in the bottom left hand corner, and I render now, that's not what I'm going to see here. You'll see, so I've completely chopped off the bottom of the door frame. So what I'm actually seeing in the Maya viewport at the moment is not what I'm actually rendering, which can get a bit tedious. So if we come up here and we tick resolution gate, you'll notice that this all goes grey, and this part in the center, this is what I'm actually going to render. So this time when I put the bottom door in the bottom left hand corner and hit render, the door will actually be in the bottom left hand corner. See, there we go. So that matches what we're seeing here. Problem with that, of course, is that now we've got all this grey kind of dead space, which can also be annoying. So if you click the camera button up here to select the camera, and we go down and we want to look for display options, and where you've got overscan, you can turn this down to 1.1, maybe even 1.05, and you can see that now I can tell what I'm going to render, and I've got less grey wasted space. You know, sometimes it's nice, especially if you're animating, to see what's just out of the shot, but if you're just doing stills, I find you can generally drop this down to say even 1.01 works fine in this case. Now, so we start to get the basic setup for the shot in. If we go back to the render settings, let's just take a look through what else we can do here. Now, because I want to save out 16 or 32-bit images, I don't really want to use PNG. Personally, I use EXR because I work a lot with Nuke, and EXR is a great format for holding images. It's also a great format for Nuke, and the reason for this is you can do a single EXR, which is perfect if you're going to use Photoshop. If you're going to use Nuke and you're going to do a lot of passes, you might want multi-channel EXR. I'll leave that up to you. I'll just use the standard one for now. And under image format options, make sure you've got the compression type set to scanline zip. If it's at no compression, which I believe might be default in older versions of VRay, then you're going to be saving really large images, which if that's not a problem for you, that could be okay. But some of these multi-pass EXRs at 32-bit can get massive. So, bear in mind that a bit of compression on the image won't actually affect the image itself, it's just how it's packed. So, and bits per channel, I'm going to leave this at 16-bit for now. You can do a full 32-bit if you need it later on, but for right now, that's my EXR options. Okay, so I'm going to come to animation, and here is where we see VRay's animation settings. Now, as we're doing a still, we're not really going to monkey about with these. So we're on start frame 1, end frame 1, which is absolutely fine for us. I'm not going to bake anything just yet. And renderable camera is perspective. We are not using the VRay frame buffer, and we're converting the image to sRGB. So if I go up to the basic VRay, we're going to be using adaptive sampling. So the sample type should be adaptive. Now in Maya, because we often use viewport subdivision, so if I can do a very simple example of this, and if you're a mental ray user, you'll be very used to Maya rendering that viewport subdivision. VRay won't render it. So if I hit 3 now and it smooths out the sphere, by default VRay is not going to render that. It'll render the unsmooth version, unlike mental ray, which will just render the smooth version. So under VRay's global options, if you've got things in your scene that rely on viewport subdivision, you're going to have to click render viewport subdivision. Okay, now if we go under the, let's see here, we'll cover some more of this in depth. I just want to get a basic scene set up so we can start to get the first of the lights in. Now our sampler type is going to be adaptive. You've also got adaptive subdivision, fixed rate or progressive, but adaptive is probably one of the most commonly ones used. It's also, in my opinion, the best way to get rooms and stuff done as quickly as possible. Now all of this has pretty much got to do with anti-aliasing. So anti-aliasing filter type is quite important. A Gaussian anti-alias filter will give you, for instance, more blurred edges to your anti-aliasing, whereas more of a Cook variable will give you sharper edges. So we'll cover a few of these. Depending on the type of scene you've got. If you've got a very hard surface scene, then you're going to want a hard anti-aliasing, whereas if you've got a more organic scene, you can get away with a smoother anti-aliasing that's probably quicker to calculate. But for right now, for our test scene, I'm going to leave everything here at its default. So this min shading rate here will also control anti-aliasing, how many anti-aliasing samples are shot out into the scene. So, once again, right now, we're going to leave all this for default, because what we're looking at to start with is a VRay setup that's good for test rendering. So you've got adaptive min and max subdivisions, and you can think about these as sort of quality controls for the whole scene. Each light and reflective surface in VRay will also have its own adaptive min and max maximum subdivisions, so you'll be able to come in later on and tweak values depending on that. For right now, I'm just going to set this to 8. Okay, and the DMC sampler. Now, this is a very important thing within VRay for overall quality control. So if you want lower quality, you would increase this amount, you would increase the noise amount and lower the samples. For higher quality, it's the other way around. Decrease this, increase this. Now, again, I'm just going to do a quick run through so we can set up for a test render. So I'm going to put this on 0.95 because a higher amount means obviously less quality in this case. I'm going to set the adaptive threshold to 0.5 and I'm going to put the min samples, I'm going to leave at 8. So min subdivs here, min samples both at 8. And right now I'm not going to do anything more than that. We'll leave GI off for the minute and we'll just do a render with those render settings. So if I come out, maybe I'll push my light back a bit so it's not quite so in our face and just do a quick render. Okay, you can see my render come in and you can see it's quite grainy, but that's fine at the moment. As I say, I like to get something set up for testing, so I don't want to push those DMC sampler values too high. Okay, so that's basically, I can live with that amount of grain in a test render. And as you can see, the anti-aliasing's not perfect. Also, this image was too small. Okay, so I just wanted to check the noise pattern here, and I can live with this kind of noise for a sample render. If we wanted to clean that up, we can start tweaking the values in here. But what I like to do is leave these values normally pretty low, pretty low quality while I'm testing. And if I wanted to reduce the noise in here, well, the noise is coming from the light in our scene, which is here. And as I said, each individual light will get its own subdivisions. So if we change these light subdivisions to say 64, and that's fairly high, so this will take a while to render, so I may have to pause, but you'll see this noise pattern, it will be greatly diminished. And let me just check under VRay comment. Okay, so I'll render this and we'll see how long this takes. You can see already that that noise is going away. So oftentimes it's a better idea, and what I like to do is tweak the subdivs on individual lights, on individual reflections. It can be slightly more time consuming when you're designing your materials or you're putting your lights up. But if you just come in to the VRay settings, and I see a lot of people, they'll just crank the max subdivisions up to 100. They'll crank all these settings down, because if you'll remember, the lower they go, the higher they are. And they'll get good looking renders. The problem is every render will take, 10 hours, 20 hours, 2 days, a week. I mean, who knows? It depends on the size of the image. Whereas if you tweak the individual lights and the individual reflective and glossy surfaces, you can get away with lower values here and higher values here only when they're needed. And we'll be covering all that in more depth as we set up the actual light for the scene. So I'm going to end this part now, and we'll come back and look at the basic settings for the GI that we're going to be using. Alright, so I hope this hasn't been too confusing, and I assure you there'll be more explanation as we go through. But for right now, this is going to be the basics for our test rendering. Alright, so I shall see you in the next part when I come back and take a look at the GI. Thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back. In this part, we're going to continue with our basic lighting setup. We're also going to take a look at the other things we need to do within VRay to get the scene to a point where we can start to do, actual test renders. So this is what we've got so far. You can see the difference between that grain there when the subdivs on this light were 8, and the difference between the sort of no grain here or very little grain here when the subdivs are at 64. So as I said, you can crank the settings here, which we won't be doing just yet, or you can actually go around and do the settings on the individual elements, which in my opinion is a better idea most of the time, because it will lead to more tightly controlled scenes and less render time. Now, another thing we need to do in this scene to get it ready is, at the moment we've got no camera controls. So we need to add the VRay camera controls onto our camera. So if we select our perspective camera here, where we change the display options, and under perspective shape, if I go to attributes, you'll see there's a thing called VRay. Now, you'll pretty much see this for everything you click on. So if I click on this door frame and we go up to attributes, you'll see VRay, and this allows me to add VRay controls to Maya objects. So for instance, if I wanted to control the displacement quality of this object from within VRay, I can click here and it will add a tab down there to do that. So if we click on the camera and we go up to attributes, VRay, physical camera, and scroll down, you'll see here I've got extra VRay attributes. So I click down there and I want to tick treat as VRay physical camera, which will tell our Maya camera that it's actually a VRay physical camera. And this gives me access to controls like the f-stop, the shutter speed, the ISO, which if you've used a camera before you'll understand, but I'll cover them in brief. So let's do a quick render once again. Let's turn the subdivs on this light down, because we can live with the grain just while we do these tests. So under VRay light, subdivisions 8 will be just fine. I also don't need an image that's quite this big, so I'm going to go to test resolution 75% and hit render. You'll see what's happened. Our image has gone pitch black. That's because we've got one light source in this image, and it's shining through a window and it's not particularly bright. So I'm actually seeing now what I'd expect to see. Okay, the thing now, we've got this physical camera. So if we were to take the F number or the F stop and push it up higher, so let's say 16, you'll see that the image goes even darker, as you would expect on a normal camera. And if I push that down, let's say I'm shooting in a dimly lit indoor room, I'm probably going to want a shutter speed that's a little higher. So let's go to a shutter speed of 6 and an f-stop of 4.2. Oh, 402. Nope, 4.2. There we go. And you'll see my image starts to brighten up quite a bit. Still not quite enough. So again, oops, because I wanted to change the ISO, and what I've done is change the shutter speed. So let's give it a fairly low shutter speed and change the ISO to 600. My apologies. Okay, and my room has lightened up considerably. So now I've got proper camera controls on my camera. So from here, and these ones, they're not actually that bad. They're better in my opinion than the ones that come on the physical camera node with VRay. So as you can see, these ones are a bit more tuned to what a camera would actually do. So for instance, if I were to take my camera and push it to a really low f-stop, say 2.8, then this will get brighter still. And the same thing, if I increase the ISO, it will get brighter and brighter and brighter. So we'll be coming in here when we do the lighting and using these physical camera settings quite a lot to achieve the look that we're going for. Okay, so as you can see, you're just going to get here what you would expect to see on a camera: lower ISO, less brightness, higher f number, more less brightness. So again, 16 would be an aperture and f-stop that I would use for taking pictures outside. But in a room lit by one light source, an f number of 16, it's going to be too high. It's going to be extremely dark. Okay, I'm not going to spend too much time on the shutter speed, ISO and f number, because if you've ever used a camera before, and I'm guessing most of you have, you'll pretty much understand what these numbers do. And if not, any photography website will give you a more in-depth look at how these three values, the f number, the shutter speed and the ISO, interact with each other. So for right now, I'm going to put this on an f of 4.2 because that's basically what I would use to shoot indoors. And I'm going to go for an ISO of maybe 400 and leave it at that. That should be good enough for us to get our, the start of our lighting tests up and running. So I can see that this is fine for me. You'll notice when we render as well that we're getting no lights in here. We get no lights on the back wall. We get exactly the light from this. It doesn't bounce about the scene at all, because you would expect some light to hit the wall here and bounce back here. You would expect light to spread out, and this is where we need the global illumination. So if I come up to the render settings again, and from VRay to GI, I'm going to turn the GI on. Now our primary bounces can be calculated in several ways. For me, pretty much always go most of the time with the irradiance map, and for the secondary bounces, brute force is going to take a bit of a longer time than light cache. So just before we go any further, I'll just pop open these so we can see. You've got some basic settings for your light cache now, and some basic settings for your irradiance map, and the basic settings for your GI globally. So I'll just render without changing anything so we can get a comparative. So there's the render with no GI, and now we'll see the render with GI, and you can immediately see that light has bounced around this scene. Okay, so without GI, your light's just not going to bounce about, and you're never really going to get anything that's going to look anywhere near half decent unless you put a lot of lights in your scene and manually fake the light bounces. And we used to do this quite a bit back in the day when calculation of GI would be extremely expensive in terms of time. And if you're animating a very large scene, you might still do that in certain circumstances, but for most of us, we'll always be using some form of global illumination. In our case, the primary bounces are calculated by this irradiance map, and the secondary bounces by the light cache. So you can see here we've got a render at 49 seconds. The quality is not terribly high. So an easy way to get some more quality within this irradiance map and light bounces is to go to the irradiance map subdivs, and I'm just going to crank these up to 100, which will be fine. It'll just give us a slightly more definition, and I like to put my preset on medium animation, and we'll get into that more later, but this one does me fine for tests. And as we go down, we can see we've got some advanced options here, none of which we're going to play with right now. The light cache subdivs, on the other hand, can go straight to 2000. It won't add much time to our render, so they'll get a bit more quality without adding too much more time. So if we just snapshot this, and as I said, you can really see that light has really done its job and bounced around with the GI on. And we do another render with just these subdivs at 2000 instead of 500, and these subdivs at 100 instead of 50, and this will give us a bit more quality, and I imagine our render time might go from sort of 50 seconds to 1 minute 30 seconds, maybe a bit less than that, maybe a bit more. You can see it's now calculating pre-passes down here. So the goal is to push it to a quality that you can work with, that's livable for you, without setting the quality too high that your test render is going to take sort of 25 minutes, especially when you're designing the first lighting and whatnot. You really want a quality that's just good enough for you to tell that you're on the right track, without taking hours and hours of time to render. So this is coming in, this is maybe a little bit too slow. For me, personally, I could live with it. And the machine I'm on, it's 1 minute and 4 seconds compared to 49 seconds. And you can see that increasing those subdivs has cleaned up a lot of the noise around here. Okay, so that's my basic GI for testing settings. And you could start to turn on ambient occlusion here and things like this, but for us, not at the moment. Now, if I look at the settings here, and I mentioned to you that VRay wouldn't render viewport subdivision unless you tick this box. Another problem with this, when we look under the settings and I get default displacement and subdivision, the max subdivs for this is set to 256, which means if I have a viewport smoothed object, it will try and subdivide it 256 times, and this is going to let my render take an awfully long time. So I'm going to set it to 32, which should be more than enough unless you're doing an extremely detailed close-up displacement. But you could probably push that max subdivs down to 8, sometimes even lower, and it is a value to experiment with because it will add time to your render. The higher it is, the longer it's going to take. Now, it won't make any difference to our scene at the moment because all of my surfaces here are pretty hard-edged, so they don't have viewport smoothing on. But bear in mind, if you've got, especially when we start to bring the cloth in, that will have viewport smoothing, and so this value in combination with render viewport subdivision becomes important for VRay. Now, as we go down here, render division is basically how big your render bucket size is, and this is much more useful if you're rendering across multiple machines. Now, you've got your dynamic memory limit, which I'm just going to leave as is for now. We'll come back and we'll tweak some of this stuff, including this use embry, which is new for VRay 3, later on when we get to trying to do a more final render. But for testing, we're kind of on the right track here. Render elements would be sort of like mental arrays render passes, and I'll tell you which you need to get out for a full set when we come to final render, but for right now I don't want to be messing with these for the testing. Now, VRay RT is VRay's real-time render engine, which is actually very, very good. It's one of the best sort of IPR renderers that I've come across. You know, it's certainly better than Mental Rays at the moment, and that's because it's capable of the GPU. Now, at the moment, I'm using two NVIDIA cards, so for me personally, I would set this to CUDA. But if you're on a non-NVIDIA card, you might want to set it to OpenCL. Both should work for any card, but some work better than others, so you know, just flick it and give it a try. If you don't have a graphics card that can support this, then you can still use the CPU version, but it's much faster as the graphics card version. So everything I'm going to leave pretty much the same, except for this GPU bundle size. I'll probably turn that down because my graphics cards are not that fancy. So this is going to be too many bundles to send at once, and I'll show you why that's important. If we go to IPR here, so I'll just click this and I'll select the whole frame to start rendering, and you can't see it, but I've got this little box popped up here, and this was going to show me what's happening. So I can see VRay building the light cache, and as soon as this is done, it will start with a real-time rendering of this based on my GPU, not my CPU. Okay, and there it goes. So once it's actually set off, if I start to spin around my scene, and you'll see it's extremely slow, and I'll show you how to optimize that in a second. But you know, I spun around the scene and this is just not updating. So this GPU Ray bundle size is just too high. I can see that rebuilding a light cache, and it re-renders. So this is a pretty quick way of doing this, although we do need some optimization here because my machine is having trouble coping with this. So I'm going to set this down to 64 and this to 4 for a start. That should speed it up a little bit. And under GI, because it's using this light cache, I'm going to set these subdivs to 500 just for this. And I'm going to hit IPR render again. Where are we? IPR, there we go. And I'll select the whole thing. And that time, you see, it comes in much faster. I can move it around, and my viewport now has no trouble moving. You know, before it was very, very slow to respond. So changing this down, I mean, if you've got a great graphics card, you might not need to. I've got two GeForce 660s tied together in this machine, so you know, just not that fancy really. So I need to change this bundle size down. But this actually is quite fantastic. If I move this so I can get this out of the way, you'll see that this is fast and responsive. This is pretty quick to render. You're never going to get, you know, a render as good as you would get it if you hit render, but for testing light fall off, light patterns and basic colors of material, it's actually quite good. So if I were to put a sphere in this scene now and make that a bit larger, over here you can see the sphere is there, and now I could, you know, get my placement. I can see where my shadows are going. So if you've got graphics cards capable of supporting it, especially if you've got some really, you know, quite nice high-end graphics cards in your machine, VRay RT can save you a lot of time when it comes to lighting. So there we go. Remember, if you're having problems with your performance, which at default my viewport hardly moves when I've got VRay RT on and I'm moving about, but you know, at a ray bundle size of 64 and a GPU rays per pixel at 4, actually this works reasonably quickly, even on a fairly low-end graphics card. Okay, so there are some other samples options in here, but most of them have to do with render time, because this will just continuously render until I tell it to stop. So you can set a max render time in there and things like that. But for us, you know, VRay RT setup, pretty simple. Okay, and I really like this, especially in a situation like we have here, where we have light that's going to be coming in through a window with some geometry on it. So VRay RT will allow me to really tweak how those shadows fall across the floor and the exact placement of the lights without having to continuously re-render. And it's fast enough to do that. As I actually move the light around, I'll be able to see the impact of that straight away. Okay, so basically in this part we took a look at just turning the GI on with some test settings. You know, if you're not going to use VRay RT, you can crank the subdivs on this up a bit. In fact, it shouldn't actually make that much difference if I set these to 2000 and go for a VRay RT render, which I'll just do by selecting the whole thing. We can see it here. You know, it's just going to take longer to build the light cache. So depending on what you need, you could keep this at a lower subdiv level. Let's come in here. You see it changes, and then it goes back to building the light cache. So it's not at all as responsive. Actually, that had a much bigger impact on VRay RT than I thought it would. So if you're using VRay RT, you want to keep this a bit smaller depending on your graphics card. You also may need to tweak the Ray bundle size, because VRay have obviously put the defaults in for people with high-end workstations. If you're on more of a gaming card, you might want to come in and turn these down. Now, the other thing you can do with VRay RT, if we go down here, and you will see settings for the viewport, because under renderer I can just change the entire viewport to a VRay RT renderer. So for me, I would normally do this at 50% resolution, because you know, I want a quick test and this is going to be too big to render all this. So then I'll flick the viewer from viewport 2 to VRay RT, and you'll see it comes in here. And now I can just move the whole thing around like it was a viewport. Okay, so two ways to use VRay RT. You can either use it from the render view, or you can just tell VRay that that's a viewport. So I'm going to just flip back to viewport 2, and I'm going to call this part done. And when we come back, we'll look at setting some proper lights up rather than this, you know, affair that we've got going on here with this area light outside the window. And I'm going to take a look at lighting with a HDR image and lighting with VRay's physical sun and sky. So I hope you found something interesting in this part, and I'll be back in the next part. Thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back. We left off in the last few parts with this simple VRay area light, or VRay rectangular light as it's called, light in our scene. And in this part I want to get down to a couple of better ways to light this up. So a few ways we could do this. We could do it with a large HDR image wrapped around it, and I've taken the liberty of just adding this ground plane, just so when I look out the window I can see a kind of basic horizon line. But other than that, the scene is the same as it was. Now, I want to look at a couple of ways of doing this. One with a VRay dome light and a HDR image mapped to it, and a directional light for sunlight. And the other way, I want to use VRay's physical sun and sky. Now, if you've ever used Mental Ray's physical sun and sky, VRay's sun and sky is fairly similar. So I want to just come in here and delete this rectangular light we've been using, and turn on VRay's sun and sky, which is actually quite simple. We just go into the render settings, we go to VRay, we scroll down until we see VRay's sun and sky, and then we create the sun and create the sky. So if I just hit a quick test render now, this is probably going to be quite overly bright, because you know, before we were simply using that one light source, and now we've got a whole sky and a sun in there. So just pause out while this renders so you can see basically what this looks like. Okay, so as you can see, we've got fairly terribly low GI settings at the moment, and the settings in general are quite low, but it's enough for us to see the light pattern. Only took 26 seconds to render. So if we look at where this light is coming from though, if we look here, you'll see we've got this VRay Geo Sun transform created. So I'm just going to actually leave that where it is, because we can see from where it is. So that's the back of our sun there, and that's the front of our sun. So our sunlight is coming in through this window over here presently, and I would say it's got a time of day on it at this kind of sun level of sort of midday probably, which is why our scene looks, let's just see it again, which is why our scene looks quite blue and quite brightly lit. Now you can start moving this sun around, which is how I normally do it, to change the sunlight, and the more you rotate the sun downwards, the darker it's going to get. The more you rotate it towards the horizon, the more sunset and sunlight you're going to get. Sunset and sunrise you're going to get. And if you point it straight up in the air, it's going to be dark. We can change that manually. Of course, we can also go under the transform node for the sun. So if I select the sun and go under the VRay Geo Sun, I can untick manual position and tell this light the local time is 4 o'clock, let's say. So let's look at where we are, and I can set a time zone. So at the moment I happen to be living in the Czech Republic, so mine is GMT +2. So I'll set it for, say, 3 o'clock, and then we can re-render and have a look at what this looks like at 3 o'clock. Okay, that's obviously 3 AM, because what we've got there is just going to render in black, basically. So let's see, let's try that again. 1500 hours, 3 o'clock in the afternoon. That's probably more like it. Okay, so that's what it looked like right now at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, according to VRay, in GMT +2 time. So as you can see, you can come in here and pretty much set your sun's position. You can set the year, the month. So 3 o'clock in the afternoon, it should be brighter in sort of July than it is in November. And let's just see if that is the case. And I can already see that's coming in a lot brighter. So if you need precisely accurate measurements, you can do it like so. But for me, it's not so necessary. So, you can place your sun that way, definitely. You can also just grab the sun's transform node here under VRay Geo Sun and hit W to move, and then just move your sun. So I'm going to do it that way. I'm just going to pull it out this window because I know where it should go. I'm going to position it slightly off to one side, and I'm going to put the sun at around about sunset. Okay, so let's come in here and have a look. And that should about do it. It's quite a nice visual representation of how the light's going to come in. And if I wanted this to strike, say, this wall a little earlier, I can always, push it over just so I can see where it's going to go. Okay, so let's do a render like so. Okay, and this whole scene's gone a lot more orange. You can see it on the pre-render. That's because the sun's very low in the sky, meaning it's, sunrise or sunset, depending on which way the house is facing. Okay, and I'll let this render in. It shouldn't take too long. And you can see I've got a nice orangey kind of light coming in here. Pretty much what I would expect to see at sort of sunset, sunrise. Okay, and we're on a really fast render because of our quality settings, as I've said. Now, what we've got here is we've got a really brightly lit room, probably too brightly lit, and this whole window is completely blown out. Now, that's actually fine on a lot of shots. If you do some indoor photography and you wanted a really brightly lit room, but your camera was pointing at a brightly lit window, in order to get the room to be really brightly lit, you're going to overexpose the window. Now we've got a little bit too much overexposure here, so what we can do to deal with this is go to our camera settings up here, go to the perspective shape, and once again change those VRay physical camera attributes. So let's say a shutter speed of 200, because that's a pretty reasonable for this, I would say. F of 8 and an ISO of 100. In fact, let's crank that F down maybe up to 16 because it's a pretty sunny day out there. And let's go again. And now I can really see the sky out there. So, you know, that's given me another problem though, because my room is now terribly dark. But one of the things I didn't discuss before was because we're lighting this room up predominantly with bounce light, what's happening here is if we take a look at the material we have on the walls, and we take a look at Lambert 1, it's 50% grey. So all of this material currently here is absorbing 50% of the light and not bouncing it back. If I was to make this a lighter colour, then we get a lot more bounce light around the place. And what I'll do is make it a lighter colour with an actual VRay material. So we'll go up to Render and Editors and we'll go up to the Hypershade. And I'll click Select Objects with Material. Where are we? There we go, Select Objects in Initial Shading Group. And then I'll create a VRay material, which is, this is the standard VRay material. And then I'll be able to click on it. And let's do this again. Select Objects, and then I'll be able to click on this one and just go Assign Material to Selection. So that will assign that VRay material to everything this Lambert 1 was currently assigned to. Now we'll make this VRay material a lot whiter. Not quite white, but you know, not far off it. And now we'll do a re-render just to see how this room lightens up. So that's what we had before. And as you can see, it's already coming in a lot lighter. I'll just pause so you don't have to sit there and watch this. Okay, and this has come in and it looks almost foggy because of all this grey, kind of really light grey bounce light kind of knocking about the place. So what we could do is again come in and adjust this, you know, maybe down a bit lower, which will again, of course, make this whole scene a bit brighter. And to be honest with you, I don't tend to spend a lot of time trying to get this to look good because I very rarely render the room you know, white with a sunset outside. This would be something that wouldn't really crop up a lot of the time. And as soon as you get some colour, some texture into the scene, that sort of foggy appearance to the whole thing is going to go away, because at the moment we have sort of one colour bouncing around in here. Now, the other thing we can do to aid this whole situation is put some portal lights outside the windows. Now, if you're familiar with Mental Ray, if you've done this with Mental Ray, you'll know how essential portal lights are to the process of lighting up a room with the physical sun and sky. Now, with VRay, it's slightly different. You don't absolutely need the portal lights. They won't make a huge difference, but I think still they make enough of a difference to warrant actually setting them up. What they'll do is they'll take the lighting information from the sky outside, or indeed from anything outside, and just help to push it in the room a little bit. Now, to create these portal lights, we need to go to Create Lights, and we're going to use VRay rectangular lights. So what we need to do is just move them outside the doors. So let's pick them up here, and then I'm going to use the U and V scale here. Now you can just scale these lights up by hitting R and using the scale. In the past, these rectangular lights have had problems when you've done that, so I've just kind of got used to using the U and V scale here. And I'm just going to scale them to the same size as the openings that they need to fit. So that's about right. I'm not going to be spot on accurate, not necessary. And of course I need to turn the light so it faces the room. And let's just grab this. So I'll just flip this around so it's facing into the room. Okay, and maybe a little bit wider on the U. There we go. Alright, so now I've got this one light in. I need to tell VRay that this is a portal light, which I can do by just scrolling down. And where have we gone? Which should be sticking out like a sore thumb. Ah, there we go, Skylight Portal. So now you'll see that I have lost control over the color temperature and the intensity, because basically it's going to take the color and the intensity from outside and just help me pump it inside. So now I'm just going to Control D to duplicate this, I'm going to move it over to here, and I'm just going to plop one by each of these windows. And I would do this regardless of whether I was using a sun and sky or a HDR. I say in VRay it's quite common to see people skip the portal lights, so you don't necessarily need them, but I'm going to show you that it does actually make a difference, even if it's not a huge difference. Okay, so let's come here and just make sure that when we duplicated this, skylight portal was still ticked. Yeah, okay, so that duplicated fine, so let's just Control D this one again. And there we go, Control D. And I'm just going to make sure that I've got one of these on each window. So there are some windows at the back, but I will do those ones off camera because, no need for you guys to watch this any more than you have done. So we'll do these three, and then we'll hit render again, and I'll show you what difference it makes. As I say, it's not going to be major, but I still think it's worth doing. So let's just make sure we're down here and we have skylight portal ticked. Excellent. Come in and let's get a similar camera angle. So let's just check out my render view. Okay, so similar-ish camera angle will do. Okay, let's make sure we've saved that. Now I'm going to snap this again with those skylight portals active. So that finished out, and if I flick backwards and forwards, you'll barely notice any difference other than the fact that I didn't quite get the same angle. So you might notice a little more blue light coming in from the outside here, and the difference is quite subtle. But once we've got some texturing on this, what I'll do is I'll go and flick all those portal lights on and off for you and do a couple of larger renders, and I think you'll notice the difference, even though it is quite, as I said, subtle. So, other things we can do with the physical sun and sky. Let's go to our render settings again and look under the physical sun and sky, and if we come up, we've got the VRay environment settings, and right now they're all overridden by the physical sun and sky. But if I wanted to use the physical sun with a background instead, this is kind of the place where I would do it. Now, depending on your preference, you can light with the sun and sky, or you can light with a HDR. Before we get into swapping out backgrounds and stuff like that, I wanted to show you another way to do this. So right now, we've got this kind of physical sun and sky rendering, which looks quite natty. If I come in here, and we'll just do a render of the outside of the house, just so we can get a better look at the sun and sky. There we go. Okay, so this is one easy way to add illumination to a room. Now, for me, I tend not to do it this way. I tend to use it more a HDR image to get it done. But it's important to be aware that the sun and sky option exists. It's pretty good. I've seen stunning renders done with it, so it's there if you need it, and we'll delve into, as I said, backgrounds and whatnot a bit later. I just wanted to show you quickly the sun and sky. So what I'm going to do is go into VRay and delete the sun and sky now. So if we render now, we should pretty much have blackness, because we have those three portal lights set up, but they just pump in light and information from outside the room. So with no information, no sky outside the room, they're not going to be able to pump in any information. So you'll see we'll just get a black render, as you can see. Okay, I just wanted to illustrate the point that there currently is nothing lighting up our scene. So I'm going to now light with a standard Maya area light. With a standard Maya directional light. So basically I'm going to use an HDR image and a directional light, and I'll just stop that because we don't all need to sit here looking at a black screen. Okay, so let's pull in create lights and directional light. Let's pull this up, let's scale it. As you're probably aware, it doesn't matter what scale this is, it won't really affect the intensity. What we will be doing though, however, is changing it so it's coming in through the window at a fairly low angle, like so. Now if I render, let's have a look, we should get streaks of sunlight coming in through the window, or in our case just streaks of this white directional light. Okay, and I want it a bit of a steeper angle, and I can see that that's not coming in very bright at all. So let's make the angle a bit steeper and change the intensity to maybe around a 5. Okay, so that's given us some light, some mimic of direct sunlight there coming in through that window. Now, that's not going to do for the whole scene. Obviously, we're going to need some light outside, because right now we've just got this one directional light coming in here, which is really just going to give us this rather drab grey kind of colour. So there's the render with just a Maya directional light. Now if we flick to the sun and sky, you'll see that this is a nice orangey kind of colour, and that's because our light here is white. So we can come in and tweak the colour on this light if we want, a bit of a more sunset colour. And that will just give us a little bit of orangey bounce light there. As you can see pretty much already, that's going to come in a bit more orange. Okay, so this has come in slightly more orange. And it should be fairly obvious now that we can't light up this scene without some sort of lighting influence from outside that's just not one directional light. So in order to achieve that, as I've said, I'm going to use a HDR image, and I'm just going to use a VRay dome light to map it on. So I'm going to go up to Create, and where are we? Lights and VRay dome, and this will put this here. Now at the moment the dome's kind of this size, so I'm going to press R to scale and just scale it up till it covers my entire scene. So, you know, around here should do it. And with that I will have extra light that's coming in from the outside. But again, I don't want just this sort of plain white colour. I want to actually give it some reference. So let's scroll down until we find Use Dome Texture. And I'm going to use a spherical HDR, so I'm going to use Dome Spherical up here under the basic parameters. And then I'm going to come down and just give it a texture. So I'm just going to click here, I'm going to click File, and just going to pop the file in here. Now I've got a HDR image here somewhere, and I'll do a couple so you can see what difference it makes on the lighting in general. So let's load this in. And it'll take the viewport a second to update. Okay, so you can see outside there, if I pull the camera outside, I've got this HDR, and I should really match the position of the sunlight to match the position of our directional light. So, you know, that's not that difficult to do. All I need to do is come in and select the VRay dome light, select the file under the file texture, come down until I see UV coordinates, which is normally closed, click here, and that will take me to the Place 2D Environmental texture, where I can do a horizontal rotation until the big sunspot is kind of over there. So, you know, it's in about the same position as my light. You don't have to be too accurate, of course. So let's try a render of this now and see what we get with this HDR image and the VRay dome light. And I can see this is coming in kind of too dark, so I don't need to let this finish. I'll need to tweak my camera settings just a little bit. So let's go up and specify a lower f-stop. Let's try 4.2 and a shutter speed a bit faster than this, maybe 100. And there we go. Now I'm getting some extra light into the room. So I'll just pause that while it renders, and then I'll put a different HDR image on it, and you can see what contribution it makes to our lighting. Okay, so here we are with the HDR outside. Now you'll see some slight blue color bleed into this room here from the sky, and those portal lights will now sort of come into their own and help a little bit with pushing this extra light information. But just to show you what difference a different HDR will make on the scene, I'll come into the VRay dome light and I'll just swap out the texture that we're using. So I'll go to source images. I have another HDR here which was more shot at sunset, with the sun slightly lower in the sky, and I'll have to give this a second because it's a very large image. So there we go, I've got a completely different HDR outside, and I did also delete the ground plane that I had there because it was no longer necessary. So let's just make sure we've got a snapshot of this, and I'll render this out with a different HDR just to show you quite dramatically how different the lighting will be. So this one rendered in about the same time as the last one, and you'll notice this one's quite a bit darker. And if we flick backwards and forwards between these two, if you look at the colour on the walls here and the walls here, you can see that background image is definitely pushing a lot of colour in. This one's a lot bluer, and I can see some greens in here, and this one is a lot more purple on the walls. So the backing plate, the HDR that you use to assist you with the interior lighting, will definitely make a difference on the light levels you get in the scene as well as the colour. Now I'm going to go back in and use the first one, but I just wanted to say before I did that, if we select our VRay dome light again and go up to intensity multiplier, if I were to give this a higher intensity, it would have a higher effect on the colours coming in. It'd also be a lot brighter outside. So let's just do that for a three-way comparison. And again, things like sampling, subdivs will depend on the quality of the light that comes in from the HDR image. So with this one being a bit dark, I feel like I'd probably get away with increasing the intensity a bit, and that's going to introduce a lot more of this bluish purpley colour from the sky, and hopefully a little bit of the dark green will bounce around in places. Okay, so that one finished rendering out, and you can see a lot more blue in here. The scene is overall brighter. If I flick backwards and forwards with the intensity of 1, intensity of 5. So, depending on the effect you're going for, and we flick back to the original one, and then if we go back one more, we can see the VRay sun and sky. Now you will notice that the VRay sun and sky shadows are a little bit fuzzy, and our Maya light has created these, extremely sharp shadows. Now if you want to blur those a little bit, sunlight is pretty sharp, but we can just do a tad of blurring on there, just to add some extra realism. So I think this is perhaps a bit bright, so I might flick this down to 3. But to be honest, we'll be getting into the lighting as we go along with the texturing. What we're looking for here is just an overall illumination level that will allow us to get on with our texturing. So I'm just going to throw that down to 3, which should be a happy compromise between this one and this one. And I'm also going to now sort these shadows out. So if we come up to our directional light, under shadows, you'll see here that we have depth map shadows turned off, ray trace shadows turned on. So this light angle, I'm going to go to 0.2 maybe, which is quite low, and I'm going to give this 8 shadow rays for now. A ray depth limit is how many times a shadow ray will pass through something. So as we have nothing really for it to pass through at the moment, 3 is just fine. So this will just slightly blur our shadows. So if I come in, and I'll make sure I've got a snapshot of that for comparison, and I'll do yet another render so you don't have to. Okay, so if we look at this now, our shadows aren't quite so razor edged on this sunlight here. They've just, gone down a little bit, and that's also the difference in the light color contribution between this HDR, an intensity of 5, and an intensity of 3. So again, depending on the look you're going for, will be entirely dependent on what intensity you need that out at. Personally, I'm going to use the first HDR we looked at. I just wanted to give you guys a comparison between the different HDRs. But I'm going to use the first one because it was the one I've used in a previous mental ray tutorial. So I wanted to get the similar sort of image that I got from mental ray. But again, that's just a very personal thing, so feel free to experiment with various different HDR spherical maps to try and get the look you're after. And I'm just going to come in once again, and I'm going to make sure that sun's in the right position. It is. Okay, so we're about ready now to get on with some basic texturing. So I'm going to come back in the next part and look at one of the bigger elements in this room, which is the floor. And as we start to texture, we'll start to take away some of this grey, hazy feeling that we've got because, you know, at the moment we've got no ambient occlusion on here and we have no real colour except pretty much white. So as soon as we start to put some textures in, you'll see the light start to come to life and the whole scene will become a lot more defined. So I will see you in the next part when I'll cover the VRay material for the floor. I'll also cover how to get a reflection map, a gloss map, and things like this. So I hope you'll be around for that, and I hope you found something interesting in this part. Thank you very much for watching. Hi, welcome back. Over the last couple of parts we've got here was kind of pleasant overall lighting for our scene, and we've got it down to a reasonable render time of 1 minute and 11 seconds. However, every second we can save here now is going to save us time when we start to do the test renders, and as we get textures in here and more complicated pieces, this render time is going to go up. So, you know, every possible saving we can make for these tests is going to be well worth it, down to the point where the scene becomes, you know, too degraded to actually see anything. So before we go into texturing up the floor and, you know, getting a look at some of VRay's materials, I want to just go through our settings and see if there's any places that savings can be made. Now the most obvious one is here under Image Sampler, under Adaptive. Well, we've got 8 subdivs. We can come down to 4 because we simply don't need that much anti-aliasing or quality at the moment. Now the DMC sampler, this is set about as high as I'd take these numbers. Any higher than this and we're going to start to lose so much quality that, you know, we might as well be looking in the viewport really. So, you know, that's about all the savings we can make on this page. But if we look under GI and scroll down, under Light Cache, you'll find Use Ray Trace Threshold. You can turn this off. Now this will cause little kind of light leaks and the bleeding of light, but really it's going to be minor, and for test renders we can put up with it and it will save us some time. By the way, if you're on an earlier version of VRay, I do not believe this is ticked by default. So if you are getting those little light leaks and it's you know, been annoying as you've been following along, you can turn this on. And that will get rid of them. Again, if you've been experimenting with VRay, perhaps you're quite new and you've never come across this before, if you are getting those little light bleeds, and I'll show you what I mean when we do a render, this will fix it. Okay, so let's go under Settings, and under VRay 3, unfortunately it's only in VRay 3, you can tick this Use Embry button. And this is basically Intel's Raycaster. It uses single instead of double precision. So far it hasn't given me any problems, and it has successfully sped up most of the renders I've done with VRay 3. So, you know, ticking this is normally a good bet to speed up renders. If you find you're getting a weird artifact in with it, which I've never had, but I have seen someone mention, then you can always untick it. But, you know, in my experience, it'll take a good couple of minutes off your render time, depending on your scene. But, you know, it's one thing that you can try. So basically, to optimize this from about a minute, should go to about 40 seconds, hopefully, which doesn't seem like a giant saving, but, you know, it's 30 seconds on 1 minute 11, and when it gets more complicated, the saving in time will become more pronounced. So, you know, just to recap, I've turned on Embry, I've turned off Use Ray Trace Threshold, and I've come in and just put these max subdivs here to 4. So let's kidnap this one and do another render, and I think we should be heading into definitely sub 1 minute, hopefully around 40 something seconds. Okay, so there we go, 42 seconds from 1 minute 11, and there's not a huge amount of difference for testing purposes. You can see those little light leaks that I tell you might experience when you turn off the light caching ray trace threshold. But, you know, that's not really going to deter us from getting some test renders to see what our textures are looking like. So talking of textures, I've got an image here of a floor. There's just some floorboards. This will be our base image. From this we'll create a gloss map, a reflection color, a reflection amount, a bump map. Basically everything we need to make a good looking floor. So let's bring it into VRay. So we'll start by assigning a VRay material to the floor. So I'm going to use the VRay material. Basically this is the go-to material. If you've never used VRay before, this will be the one you'll be using most often. And if you're a mental ray user, this is kind of like your ArcViz material. It's really the Swiss Army knife of materials. It will do a bit of everything from refraction to a bit of subsurface scattering. It's got normal and bump built in, you know, just fairly similar to the ArcViz material in mental ray, really. Anyway, so diffuse color. So under here, what you'd expect to get is basically the diffuse color. So we're going to load in that floor color map, and I'm going to show you where we're going to hit a problem straight away. And well, this is actually a different problem because my floor is not showing up. So let's just make sure I have hardware texturing turned on. I do not. So that's created a bit of a glitch for us. There we go. So now I can see my floor on there. I'm also going to tweak my viewport 2 options a little bit. So I'll just go up to viewport 2 and I'll probably turn on the anti-aliasing for viewport 2, and you'll see that just smooths out the viewport anti-aliasing and maybe even bung in a bit of ambient occlusion. So that'll do for that. Now, the problem I was going to mention is best illustrated with a render. Okay, so let's just get in here and render this. And this has to do with the fact that our viewport here is gamma corrected. If you'll remember the first part of the tutorial, we went in and told VRay to gamma correct this viewport. You know, another way we could have done it is just set this to 2.2 if you are using Maya 2015. But regardless of that, we have gamma on this viewport, which is exactly what we want. Unfortunately, pretty much all file textures we use are going to be sRGB file textures. They're already going to be gamma corrected. So what's going to happen is it's going to look at this file texture which is already gamma corrected, and then it's going to gamma correct it once again in this viewport, which will lead to this kind of washed out looking texture that we're getting here. If we look in Photoshop, it's a lot darker and a lot, you know, more vivid than it is here in Maya. Now in VRay there's several ways to deal with this. We could just come up here and under, let's have a look, VRay, under color mapping, we could come down and color map in advanced, hit linear workflow, which will just automatically remove the gamma from these textures. But this is a very depreciated workflow now in Maya. So, you know, you can do that. It's a quick fix, but I wouldn't really recommend it at the moment. And in fact, if you do use it, you'll probably get VRay complain that they're going to depreciate that particular workflow in upcoming versions. So not something you really want to get used to doing. Now, another way of doing it is we can click this texture to bring up the material, and I'll just call this floor texture. And under attributes, as I said, each one of these is each thing in Maya will have something you can add for VRay. So if we go to the actual file texture itself and go to attributes, VRay, I can click this texture input gamma. Okay, so under VRay extra attributes, I now have texture input gamma, and I'll just tell VRay that this texture was an sRGB image. That way it will know not to gamma correct it for this viewport, because it doesn't need to, it's already been done. So if we just snap this one and go again, you'll see a darker, more vibrant looking floor. Okay, so that finished up, and that's what it looks like, very washed out with that double gamma correction on it. And here we have a much more vibrant looking floor, much closer to the color here in Photoshop as well. So every time you use a gamma corrected texture, which will basically be any texture that's not a linear image, you're going to have to go to the file node, go to attributes, VRay, put a texture input gamma on there and tell it what it is. You know, is it a linear image? Is it an sRGB image? Do you want to put the texture gamma in manually yourself? In most cases, flicking this to sRGB will work just fine, and the color you get in here will match the color that you're expecting. Now, another thing I would do if we go up, we'll see our texture filter type is quadratic, and this is going to cause some blurring on the texture. So if we come down here under effects, we can just turn that filter down to 0.1. And if I take another render and flick backwards and forwards between the one I saved, you'll see that one texture is slightly sharper than the other. Now, this doesn't always make a huge amount of difference, and you might have trouble viewing it on the tutorial screen because the video compression might make it a little difficult to see. But trust me on this, turning this filter type down to 0.1 will allow your textures to blur a little bit, but not too much. So here we go, this has just come in, it shouldn't take too long. Okay, so if you look right here on this image, it's where it's most visible. If I flick backwards and forwards, you can see that this one is blurrier than this one. Now the effect is quite subtle, but you know, when you're looking for a fairly realistic render, these little subtle tweaks that you make sort of stack up on top of each other to create a better overall image. So, you know, on something like floorboards, I'd like the texture to be more sharply defined, so I just leave the filter type to quadratic, come down and adjust the filter here to 0.01. Now, my floor looks washed out in viewport 2, and I can probably fix that. To be honest, it doesn't bother me that it doesn't quite match in the viewport. If I want to, I can come down and click this off, because we're not gamma correcting the texture so Maya's viewport can see that we have. So let's just turn that off and I'll get something closer to my render view. Okay, the other thing is, I think personally these floorboards are a bit too thick, they're a bit too big, so I can come in, grab the 2D texture node, grab the material, and let me just go backwards one. Yeah, great. Material attributes, there we go. So here's my material. Go into the diffuse file node and come into the place 2D texture node and just repeat this texture. This is a tileable texture, so I'll try for 3, give that a second, and 3. And those floorboards now look absolutely tiny, so might have repeated those a little too much. So 2 and 2, and we should be about golden. Okay, so that looks perfectly adequate to me. And now we've done that, you know, the next thing we want to do is get some form of bump mapping in here. First, before we start to look at reflections and whatnot, I want to bump map before I do that. In fact, let's just go into Photoshop and create all the maps we'll need in one fell swoop. So, you know, a bump map for this is quite easy, and I'll just duplicate this out so we have something to work with. I'll turn the background off for now. And a bump map, so I'm just going to go up to image adjustments and I'll go to hue and saturation, and I'll just turn the saturation off so this is black and white. And then I'll come up here, and what I'm looking for in a decent bump map is I want, you know, everywhere that's black to be bumpy. So all these areas, you know, between the floorboards here, you know, this is looking not too bad. I'm just going to tweak the levels a bit. So let's just go to fit on screen, image adjustments, levels. And let's come in and crank the blacks up and the lights down until I get an image that's kind of like so. Maybe those blacks went too high. And you know, sometimes it's necessary to come in with brush tool and brush out areas of strong bump, depending on, you know, how separated you want these floorboards. For a quick test, this will do me as a bump map. So I'll call this bump, so I know where I'm at. Now, that that's done, I'm going to make another copy of this. And what I'm going to do on this one is the reflection color. Now, we want a specular color for this wooden floor that's going to return a white specular highlight. So the color of this, if we left it as is and it returned this color, it would look metallic. So if you want something to get a white highlight when you're using a reflection color, what you need to do is invert the hue of the material. Now, you could just Control I and invert the whole material, but that's not quite what you want. It will work as a quick, simple fix, but a better way to do it is to go up to Image Adjustments and take the hue and saturation and just shift this 180. And now I've inverted just the hue, which means if I use this as a reflection map, a reflection color, sorry, this is going to give off a white reflection. Whereas I left it this color, it would give off an orange reflection, which would look metallic. So metallic objects tend to reflect back the same color that they are. So a copper object would reflect back a copper color. Whereas something like a floor with a shellac on the top will reflect back white. So in order to achieve that, again, just adjustments, hue and saturation, and just invert the hue. Just drag it plus 180. Okay, so that's a reflection map, color for us. Sorry. Now we want a reflection amount. So the darker this would be, the less reflective it would be. So for a reflection amount, we want to come up, and again, I'm going to use black and white. So I'm just Image, Hue and Saturation. And I'm going to just turn the saturation off. So reflection amount, how much reflection do we want and where do we want it? So where it's black, there'll be no reflection. So I doubt you'd want reflection in the gap between the floorboards. But also, you know, I don't want this to have a completely different level of reflection all over it. I want it to be a fairly consistent reflection. So there's a couple of ways to do this. I could do it with the, let's see, filter, other, and high pass. This will kind of equal out the tone of the floor for us. And it's generally not a bad thing. So this will give you quite a stable reflection map. These areas here will be less reflective. So the knotted wood areas will be less reflective. And sometimes it's beneficial to invert your reflection amount. Okay, so that would make these dark wooded knots more reflective. So again, it depends on what you're looking for. And it's also going to put a nice highlight in between the boards, which technically shouldn't have a reflection, but it will catch light on the edges. So again, it just depends what you're looking for. But remember, the whiter this thing is, the more reflective it's going to be. So I don't really want a floor that's this reflective, so I'm going to come up, Adjustments, and I'll go to Levels, and I'll just pull this down so it's overall a little bit darker. And let's get those mid-tones a bit darker too. And that should be reflective enough. Now, you know, you can, of course, invert it. And I wouldn't do that on this copy now. But I'm going to use this as a reflection map first off. And then we'll take a look at an inverted reflection amount, reflection map amount. And you can see the difference yourself. So now we've got your standard diffuse color. We've got a reflection amount. Again, the lighter this is, the more reflective. We've got a reflection color. The more closer to the original color this reflection color is, the more it's going to look like metal. And we've got a very simple bump map. Okay, so that should do us for now. Let's go feed these into VRay and see what we get. Now, you're not always going to get, you know, perfect first time, so we'll do a couple of renders and we may have to come back and tweak some of these. Now this should be pretty good. So we'll go into our material, our floor texture, and we want to make sure that Use Fresnel is ticked. Now lock Fresnel IOR to refraction IOR. We don't want this because we're not using any refraction, and our refraction IOR is 1.6, which we could change there, but we're better off unticking this And wood's going to have a Fresnel index of reflection of anywhere between 3 and 5, and you can look this up online, and I'm going to just use 3 for now. Trace reflections, the max depth of 5 should be just fine. And we're going to come in here, and for reflection color, excuse me, I'm going to have to save that out of Photoshop. So File, Save As, and I'm just going to basically save this as a JPEG, stereo JPEG. There we go, and I'll call this Reflect Color, and let's crank it all the way up to 12. There we go. So this would be the reflection amount, and this particular one was an inverted reflection amount, so I can show you what that looks like. And this is going to be reflect amount. Okay, and this is just our standard diffuse, which we already have. So did we save our bump out? I don't think we did. And once again, JPEG will be fine, and diffuse bump. Okay, so let's go plug all of these things in. Alright, so reflection color we've plugged in. Actually we haven't, so let's plug that in, sorry. And under file node, you can just come in and reflect color. This is the one I created just now in Photoshop. Okay, and this reflection color, it's not really going to need any filtering, so I'm going to turn that off. And go back to the material, which for some reason it keeps giving me grief, but not to worry. So now let's look. So we've got a diffuse, we've got a reflection color, a reflection amount. Let's come here and do this. So once again, File, and let's give it the reflect amount that we created, which was this JPEG. And once again, you're not going to need any filtering on that. It's not really going to make a lot of difference whether you turn that on and off for this, but you know, might as well since we're here. So we've got a reflection amount, we've got a reflection color. We haven't done a gloss map yet, but let's skip that for a second, and let's go down to the bump mapping and feed in our little bump map there. So diffuse bump, there we go. Let's plug that in, and this is probably going to need a lower bump multiplier than that, so let's try 0.1 to start with. So now we've got a bump map plugged in, we've got a reflection color, which is our blue color, so we reflect back white. We've got a reflection amount, which would be the amount of reflection that we want, and we've got a diffuse color. So let's take a look and see what that looks like. Let's just get a decent camera angle on this so you can get a big view of the floor. And I'll come in and just hit render. Okay, so here we have one shiny floor in comparison to this one, which was matte, and you can see that the white's reflecting. It's reflecting well here and here. If we had a point light source now, that would, you know, reflect back white because of our reflection color. And before I wrap this part up, because it's been about 25 minutes now, I believe, I just want to show you what happens if this is the reflection with this reflection amount, which we inversed. So basically these little knots of wood are going to be shinier, and in between the floorboards are going to be shinier. Now I'm going to do a different reflection amount map, so let me just go ahead and duplicate this. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm just going to go to image adjustments, and I'm going to hue and saturation, take down the saturation so it's black and white, and now I'm going to use a high pass filter, to just kind of flatten it all out so it's not too dissimilar. Okay, and then I'm going to adjust the levels till I get what I feel is a reasonable amount of reflectivity. I don't want too much in this, so I am going to make it quite dark. Let's darken up those mid-tones. There we go. And maybe darker a little overall, so like so. Now I'm going to save this out. Whoops, which I do not want save for web this time. Save as. And I'm going to go to JPEG, and I'm going to take this as reflection amount version 2. So let me just make sure that that's all right. Let me actually call this version 3, because I believe I had a version 2 before. I just want to know exactly which one it is. And I'm going to pop back into Maya and plug the reflection amount in. So before we were using reflect amount V2, now we'll use reflect amount V3. So that was V2 and this is V3. Basically this one is slightly darker, but also it's not inverted. So, you know, this one and this one. So in this reflection map, these knots of wood here will be non-reflective, and other details will reflect. Now again, it depends on what type of surface you're doing, whether you would invert it or not, and sometimes I'll have a play backwards and forwards just to see what looks better in the actual render. So let's make sure we have a snapshot of this, and I've got that reflect map in there, reflection amount in there, and let's do a render and compare the difference. Okay, so here we go. Here's with a non-inverted reflection amount. So I'll snap backwards and forwards, and you'll see there is quite a change. Now, depending on how you want your floor to look, will be dependent on how you generate those maps. And there is one other thing that I wanted to cover before we go. At the moment, we've got a reflection glossiness of 1, which basically is going to mean that our reflections are completely mirror sharp, and you know, this is generally not the case unless you've just polished your floor to within an inch of its life. They're going to be slightly blurry, smudged reflections. So we can actually achieve that by turning the reflection glossiness down to say 0.9, and what we'll get is a smudged reflection glossiness. Now if you want to create a glossiness map, the way I'd normally do it for something like a floor is take this one that we've created. In fact, let's just make another one. So let's take another snapshot of our base texture here. I'm going to come in and go once again and just knock the saturation off it. And this time I'm going to make it again so it's high pass filter on it. And then this time I'm just going to come in and do the adjustments on the levels, and this time I'm going to make it very bright. So really I just want a tiny bit of variation in there to show some smudges. So that should do it. I want a overall level kind of here. Okay, and let's try this. So I'm going to call this, and just once again, just a JPEG. You can use whatever format you want, but I'm not going to be rendering out a huge 4K image of this, so a JPEG will be just fine in this case. And I'll call this diffuse gloss. Okay, and let's go into Maya and plug this into the materials reflection glossiness. So file and load this in and diffuse gloss. There we go. Okay, turn this off. Again, it's not really going to be a huge impact if you forget, especially on a non-visible texture. So let's snapshot this and go for another render. Okay, so with that reflection glossiness map that we just did, if we look here on the floor, I'll flick back to the other one, you'll see where our reflection before was extremely sharp. Now it's a little blurry. So now it makes, for a better render, you're not going to get this massively, monstrously sharp reflection. And if we had a bigger render, you'd see that this has also gone a little grainy now, which I can use then increase these reflection subdivs to increase the quality. So I'm going to leave this part for now. We're going to come back and we're going to do some more on this floor, but in between the parts, what I'm going to do is just tweak my maps a little bit. I think my reflection amount here is maybe a little dark, and the contrast between light and dark is giving me a kind of mottled effect that could be nice on some surfaces, but I think what I'll do is lighten this up a little bit and kind of knock some of the contrast out just a tad. So I'm going to do that, as I said, off screen, because no one really wants, I think, to watch me work in Photoshop for the next 10 minutes. And all of the maps will remain pretty much the same, except this inverted one that we didn't use. So let's drag that in the bin. So basically this is my technique for creating some quick, simple maps. So you've basically got your quick, simple bump map, your reflection color, your reflection amount, and your gloss map, which I went ahead while I paused the render and made a little bit darker just to give myself a little bit more gloss, because the lighter this is, the less gloss you're going to have, and of course the more gloss, the more blurry your reflections. So I will make sure that I will let you take a look at any maps that I change in between the parts, but they'll all be created on the same principle. So I'll be back in a moment when we'll look at kind of finishing off this floor at least to a point where we're sort of 90% happy with it. And then at the end of the tutorial, we'll come back in and tweak any materials we might have issues with, or that might just need a bit of finessing. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you on this material, at the moment, the bump map is kind of embedded in the wood here, and we can see it's quite bumpy. I'm also going to show you how to use the VRay layered material to create a more shellacked floor, so I'll have a more perfect reflection. So I will see you in the next part, and I hope you found this useful. Thank you very much for watching. Hi, welcome back. In the last part we finished up here, and in this part we're going to continue looking at some different VRay materials. Namely, I want to do some curtains in this part, so I want to get into some translucency and some transparency, and the texture mapping I'm going to use for that in terms of transparency and translucency maps. But first, I just want to take a look at this scene while we have it in this quick to render form. And if you'll remember, a couple of parts ago we put in these portal lights, which I said would make some subtle difference. So what I'd like to do just before we go any further is just tweak the lighting in this scene a bit, because our main directional light here is still orange from when we had the matching sort of evening time HDR in the background, and this one's a lot more blue. So I'd like to change the color of that. Before I do that, I want to turn these lights off. So all of these portal lights that we have on the outside of the building, which is just a area light with the sky portal ticked here, I'm going to turn these all off, and I've added two also to the back room windows, which I've just done by copying and pasting this one and putting it into position. So this is basically a render with all the portal lights on. What I want to show you now is a render with all the portal lights off, and you will see a difference. You'll definitely see more color is being pushed into the scene from the outside. A lot of that will disappear when I turn these lights off, but the difference is quite subtle. And as I said, there's a lot of people who render within VRay that just skip the whole creation of the portal lights, but I like to think it adds a little something. So as I said I'd demonstrate what it did when we turned them off, I will. So I'm just going into all these rectangular lights and toggling the enable tab, so we can just, before we tweak the main light, get a look at what that looks like with these turned off. So let's just use our camera bookmark to get back to this render position, make sure I have a snapshot of it, and I'm going to render that out, and I will see you in about a minute. Okay, so here's our render with the portal lights turned off, and as you can see on first blush it looks like not a lot has changed, but if I flick backwards and forwards you can see the portal lights are shoving a fair bit of light in there, but more importantly they're shoving a fair bit of light colour in. If we look at this back room, it's a lot bluer here than it is here. So as I said, the difference with those portal lights make, they are quite subtle. They will help some inside colour and luminosity come into the room, but unlike mental ray where portal lights are fairly essential for this type of rendering, within VRay you can get away with skipping them, but it's literally a couple of minutes setup. So, you know, I've sometimes skipped them, but I've always set them up first just to see the contribution that they have. So we'll just go ahead and turn those back on, because in this case I want that extra information pushed in from the outside world. And then I'm going to take a look at this room rendered now with a different light color, because as I said, we should be pushing more blue in here, but at the moment we're quite warmly lit, and you know, some of that's coming from the floor, the light bouncing off this warm brown color, but a lot of it's coming from the light here, which probably has its color set incorrectly. So if we come up and we just make it a very pale blue, sort of just to give some impression of sunlight to match the blue sky in our HDR. And once again, I'll take a quick render of this so you do not have to, and I'll be back once again in a moment. Okay, so you can see here our scene went a lot whiter. Our whites are now white, they're not off color. And you know, depending on what look you're going for, it will depend on the light color, what time of day and whatnot, because unlike VRay's physical sun and sky that will change the color of the light automatically depending on the time of day, we have to do this manually. But I've got a fairly blue sky out here, and what I had before was this, which is fairly orange. It's a lot warmer, and there we have a lot colder. So depending on the look you're going for, I kind of like the cold color in contrast, in deference, to the sky, works better for me. Now the other thing I should mention is you'll notice that my reflections here on my floor are slightly different than they were in the last part, and I mentioned that I might tweak the reflection map for this floor, so I'll just pull it up so you can see what it looks like. And if you remember before, it was very dark. That's alright, that's reflection color. I want reflection amount. Everything else remained the same, purely changed this. So basically it's just overall a little bit lighter than it was, so it's given us a little bit of a stronger reflection, and it has a little bit less contrast, and that was really all I changed. So, you know, before we go on, because there are a few things that I wanted to show you with the floor, with the layered material and whatnot, but before we go on, I want to block out some other areas of the scene here. I want to start to bring in some of the other major elements, and as I said at the beginning, one of the first things I want to cover is a VRay two-sided material to get a translucent effect, and I also want to discuss how I'm going to create a transparency map for that in Photoshop and how that all fits together in a VRay material. So I'm going to bring in my room bits here, and what we're going to be working on is these curtains. So, you know, really I don't want a lot of this other stuff getting in the way, so I'll look for the bed and hope it's all in one part. It is, and then I'll just grab all the other bits and pieces that are around, mainly the cloth really, because I don't want to take the time to render it, and I'll just hide it away. So that will do. So Control H to hide there. You could have also put it on another layer and done it that way, but for right now I'm going to be working mainly on these curtains, so I'll leave that as is and just hide it. Alright, so we've got these curtains and we want them to be translucent and transparent, but we also want to put some sort of pattern on them, because I want these to represent sort of a very light net curtain. So if we look at translucency to start with, and this is best shown on one of these back curtains, so I'll actually have to find where I've just hidden it, because I've actually hidden it away, and to be honest with you that shouldn't matter. I'll just use this one instead for illustrative purposes. So let's just come up and center the pivot on this, and let's just, whoops, I've actually got more than one thing selected, and let's just come up and move this over here. What I'm looking for is part of the curtain that's going to be exposed to the light at the window, and part of the curtain that's going to be, behind the wall, because a translucent object should obviously be much brighter with a light source shining through it. So in order for us to make this translucent, I'm going to use a VRay two-sided material. So if we go to Assign New Material, and I just select the VRay two-sided, which is here, VRay Material Two-Sided, you'll see pops up an option. I've got a front material and a back material. Now in our case, I'm only going to use one material. The two-sided material is capable of putting one material on the front of an object and one material on the back, hence the name, but it can also be used for this translucency. So I'll just pop open the hypershade, and without getting too fancy, we'll just use our white standard VRay material that we created. So this VRay material 1, it's a bog standard whitish VRay material. It's on pretty much everything in the room at the moment, so we're just going to use that. Now if I flick this up here, it'll be completely white. It won't change whatsoever. In fact, let's just, for now, I want to hide that. Let's just for now frame this shot, and I'll show you that this will now look like just a completely white curtain. Exactly what you would expect to see is what you will see. Okay, so I reframed this a little bit so we could see it better, and I can crank the gamma up here a bit so lighten the shot up. And apart from these very obvious lighting errors that we've got because we're on low quality, this area of the curtain here is kind of solid fabric. So is this, but I would expect this to be lighter because there's sunlight shining through it, or at least a more brightly lit daylight exterior than sort of hanging against a dull wall. So that's where our two-sided material comes in, really. I can now go like this and take the two-sided this way. So this would be completely with no translucency, and as I get up here it will merge translucency in there. So I'll go for quite a high translucency so the effect is fairly exaggerated, and what we should see is everything that's kind of, where the window is should be lighter than everything that's hanging directly against the wall. And we'll get to some higher quality shots later on, of course. I like to block out my basic materials with the test render settings that we're using, simply because it's a lot faster to work with, and then at the end I like to get a couple of full quality render where I can then make the decision on what materials need extra tweaks. So I'll just let this finish and I'll be back with you in a second. Okay, so that rendered out with the translucency actually cranked up. It's a little over exaggerated, but you can see here around the top of the curtain, and again the quality is quite poor, so this will only get better as we go along, but it illustrates the point at the top of the curtain and around the side of the curtain. They're not translucent at all, really, because they're behind a solid background. But this one that has light shining on it from this outside HDR, it's quite lit, and you can even see through it the kind of lines in the doorway here. So that's a really quick, fast way to get some translucency on a material like a curtain. Now if I was going to do this properly, I would add some transparency into the material itself, into the VRay material that we're using here, but I just wanted to illustrate this translucency first. So in order to get a better idea, I'm going to work on these bed curtains, because like I say, these were fairly interesting material to make because they're sort of a net curtain effect, which gives them some transparency, some translucency, and basically transparency in very specific places like the holes in the netting. So I'm going to actually make the netting in Photoshop, and I'll try and get this done very quickly because, as I said, I don't want this to turn into a huge Photoshop tutorial, but this will take a couple of minutes. So the first thing I want to do is get a UV snapshot out of Maya. So I'm just going to go up to UV snapshot, and 4K is probably a bit heavy for what we're looking at, but you can go any size you want, of course, but 2K will do for me. Let's see, 2048, 2048. Okay, and this is the UV map of those curtains. So quite a simple one to draw around in Photoshop. and I'm going to just save that out as that will do, and I'll go for a PNG and OK. Okay, so that's saved that out in my VRay tutorial new directory. So I've got in Photoshop here a cloth pattern that's sort of like a net curtain cloth pattern. Now this technique will work with any pattern that you come up with. So we're going to open up the UV map here, which I believe went into images. Okay, so we've got our UV map. Now it's difficult to see without any backing plate on it, so let's grab a new layer, pull it to the bottom there, and just shove on a standard, that's a bit grey, white would be better. And now we have something to draw around. But what I want is basically solid seams on this thing. It will make it a lot more realistic if we have kind of a solid hemmed edge around it, and maybe a few down the middle as separation panels. So, you know, the first thing for me would be to get the cloth pattern over this image. So I'm going to create a new layer, and rather than kind of dragging my cloth pattern up, dropping it in here and replicating it, trying to tile it about manually, I'm going to just make a Photoshop pattern of it. So this is a pretty simple thing to do. And also this cloth pattern overlaid on a 2K image is going to be pretty big. So let's just go image size and tone this down a bit. Okay, so now I'm just going to go up to where am I? Create pattern. Define pattern preset. There we go. Now define pattern, sorry. I'm going to call it cloth 11 JPEG, it will be fine for now. And then I'm going to come into here and go edit, fill, make sure I've got that blank layer, and use this custom pattern, this one I've just created, and click OK. And that fills my texture up here. Now you can make a decision on whether that's too small. Let's look at it in its actual size. I think that'll be about fine. That should give me a fairly nice net curtain effect. But you know, all of this is slightly trial and error when you get it in the render, so you might find it needs to be a bit bigger or a bit smaller. You know, that just comes with knowing what you want for your scene. And right now I'm going to draw the seams in. Now, as this is a transparency map, what we'll be looking for is everything that's white will be transparent. So if we look at our pattern, all these white holes in it will be transparent, and these black lines will be opaque. Will be non-transparent. So, you know, when it comes to draw our seams, we want to draw a black solid line around our curtain UV, so it will look like a seam. So I'm going to do it on a separate layer, just in case I need to make it a bit thicker or, you know, a bit less thick. I'm going to pick a brush size, which I'll make black, and I'm just going to come in and draw a seam. Let's turn the hardness, that's about right. There we go. Maybe a bit bigger, and that should do. So I'm just going to come in here and put a black line in down the sides where the seams would be, like so. And this won't allow these seams to show any transparency or indeed translucency, because we'll be using the same map for both, which is great for us because, you know, it will really give that impression that we actually have a cloth material with seams in. Now I'm going to draw some dividing panels in here, and normally I'd measure these out a bit better, but to avoid it taking too long, I'm just going to sort of swamp them in like so. And you might want to take a bit of time and do this with a tad more accuracy, but you know, for now this will be fine. It will illustrate the point quite nicely, I should think. And I'll be using this same map, I think I just said, for both translucency and transparency. Because, you know, in a curtain like this, I'd expect wherever it was translucent to also be transparent. So I'll take this overlay on. I no longer need this, I don't need that. And this now becomes our curtain translucency stroke transparency map. So let's save that out. and we'll put that in the proper folder, the source images, and I'll just make it a JPEG once again, and I'll call this bed drapes transparent. Okay, so let's take this now and start to design a material that will be transparent for our bed shapes, which in VRay is actually a pretty simple exercise. Okay, so these are the bed drapes we want. Let's just get a camera angle for render so we get a good look at them. And I'm going to take this one and just assign a new material to it. So in this case, just a VRay standard material, which we will then be plugging into a VRay two-sided material. The standard material will generate the transparency, the VRay two-sided will generate the translucency. So we'll come in here, and first things first, a diffuse color. Now, I'm doing a fairly old wooden bed here, so it's going to be sort of a chipped paint effect. So I don't want bright white curtains. I want a kind of, sort of color that they would have aged with, sort of if you had a bedroom full of smokers, that sort of slightly off white, yellowy kind of nicotine color that comes with age. So there we go. First things first, I got the color on my curtain, and again might be subject to tweak once the transparency goes on. So then we just need to come down here, and we're not going to be putting any reflectivity on this. What we're looking for in VRay is refraction, and this will deal with the amount of transparency we have, slightly different to a lot of mental ray materials that just have a transparency slider. Here we have refraction color, so at black it's going to be non-transparent, at white it's going to be fully transparent. You can see in the viewport that it goes like so. So let's feed our little transparency map that we made in there. So source images, and we're going to go bed drapes transparency. Okay, now the viewport's not going to show that properly, but I can kind of see the seam up the side of the curtain there and there. And in fact, if I just dump that texture in the diffuse for a second, you'll get a better look at what it's actually like. So let's come in and hit the material attributes on this, and I'll just dump it in the diffuse. Remember to take it out before you render. And let's go bed drapes transparency, and then I'll go and knock the transparency off this. Maya seems to be playing a little bit silly buggers with me at the moment, but there we go. So I'll just knock off the transparency, and you can see these thick black lines where a seam would be. So now we've got sort of a panelled look, and you can see the one down here, and this was all the stuff that we drew out in Photoshop. So I normally throw it in a diffuse material just to make sure that the UV was correct and it's all where I expected it to be. So that's actually fine. And once again, we're going to want to take that off the diffuse and put it back on the transparency. So I'm going to break the connection here, and the diffuse color, I'll just go back and put that slightly yellowy color that we had on there. And the reflection color, I'll actually have this, rather than clicking this and adding another file texture, I could simply go to Hypershade and check under textures. And as you can see, I've already got one, so I can just drag this into here, which will go under refraction amount, and we'll just jack the refraction color up to white. Okay, so this should now be the transparency we're after. So I'll do a quick render, and we can see the difference. One, it's just transparent, and when it's transparent and also translucent. Okay, so I've actually paused this render because I've actually missed something in my rush to kind of get these renders out to you. You'll see this looks almost like glass, and it's very obvious that this picture behind here is being refracted through the curtain, which is something you might expect in a sort of wine glass or a glass bowl, but definitely not something you'd expect on a curtain. And we've missed, or I've missed rather, sorry, something extremely simple, which is the index of refraction, which is currently set to an IOR of 1.6. Now, if you want that to be perfectly clear, like a window pane, which when you look through it, of course, it doesn't refract the environment in a kind of spherical way, so what you see is what you're actually looking at. We want an index of refraction of 1, which is actually, I believe, flat window glass and air. So this time we won't actually get these weird kind of light, almost glass texture to it. So I just thought I'd interrupt my render just to apologize. I forgot that, and I'll be back with you in a minute. Okay, so that render finished out, and it's now at almost 3 minutes, because obviously it's dealing with a lot of transparency here. And if we take a look, you can quite clearly see the netting on our curtain, which is perhaps a bit too big. I would make this much finer, and I'll actually go in and do that between the parts. All I'll actually do is take this pattern, reduce the size of it a bit, re-overlay it on this graphic, and basically I'll re-render before I come back. But I would like this weave to be a bit finer, but you can see our seams have worked rather nicely, and the paneling in between is clearly visible, and it gives a much needed air of a kind of realism to have this seam running down the side of a curtain like you would in real life. And I also am partial to the paneling. The problem is, with just transparency, we're not seeing the light strike against here. And this bit here against this white bed is as transparent as this bit here. And I want translucency involved in this equation. So, I want these to basically be like this, where this is definitely translucent and this is definitely opaque. So in order to do that, we'll use this material as the base for our two-sided material. So I'm going to come into these curtains and assign a new material to them, which will just be a VRay two-sided. So I'll just come up and go for material attributes, and I'll give this a name I understand. So bed drapes two-sided, and as a front material I'll go into my hypershade, back to materials, and I'll pick the bed drape material that we are using, which I believe is this one. It is. So I'll also name that. And I'll then grab two-sided material, which is called bed drape, and pull the bed drape transparent into the front. And we know now from our experiments with the back curtain that the further this is this way, the more translucent it will be. But I don't really want to use this. I'd rather use the same texture I used on the curtains. You can experiment, and I encourage you to do so. In fact, I don't need to load another texture in, because as we know, we've got it here. So I'll just middle mouse, drag and drop that file texture into there. And now when I render, I think you'll see a bit of a difference. You'll see the light will actually hit the curtains and the translucency will come into effect. So let's make sure we have snapshot, and I'll be back in probably about 4 minutes now with translucency. Okay, so here is our render with translucency, and I have to say, when I dragged the translucency texture into this material, I accidentally dragged it into the back material instead of the translucency texture shot, so please don't do that. You want basically just the front material and this as translucency, which at the moment is driven from this texture. So just to note that I yet again made another mistake on this material. It seemed to be a problem with me today, so I apologize for that. But your translucency texture obviously wants to go into the translucency texture slot, not into the back material. Right, anyway, if we compare these two, so this was the first one with no translucency, and this one has translucency. You see it's given a lot more weight to our curtains here. They look a lot more realistic, as I would expect light to be able to strike these curtains. Now we still have the problem where this weave is too big. I would like this to be a much finer weave. So in between the parts, I will, as I said, go into Photoshop and create a better weave. I'll just make it slightly smaller. basically, in essence. And then we'll look at the bed texture, which will use a VRay layered material to mix a traditional kind of wood texture with a white gloss paint material, and then a scratch map in between to scratch some of the paint off the bed so we can see the wood underneath. So I hope you found something informative in this part. Apologies again for the slight mistake, and I will see you in the next part. Thank you very much for watching. Hi, welcome back. So in between the parts, I've simply decreased the size of this weave pattern so it's a little finer. Now you could probably go even finer than this if you wanted to, and I might do during the final material tweaks, but you can pick out lots of these patterns online and decide which one is the best one for you. But for me, this is looking okay for now. So I want to actually move on to the bed, and for the bed I want to use a VRay blend material, or a layered material. Now it's called the blend material in VRay. If you're used to Mental Ray, you'll recognize this as kind of a layered shader. So how we're going to go about this is we're going to create a wooden layer for the bed here. Basically just your standard wood tileable texture, and then on top of that we're going to overlay a glossy paint, and then we're going to use a scratch map in between the two to scratch off some of the gloss paint and expose the wood underneath. Now I'll show you what our scratch map looks like and why it might cause us some problems. So this is the scratch map that I'll be using, and this was generated in Mari, but I used UV patching to do this. So basically it's not one texture, it's three that has to fit on one object. So I'm going to show you how to do that and feed it into Maya, so all three textures are basically applied to the same object as one scratch map. But before we get into that, I just wanted to give you a quick look at what we'd be dealing with. Before we get into that, I want to take a look here at the base material for the bed, which will just be, as I said, a sort of dark wood. So let's go ahead and apply a new texture to this. And before I do that, I'm just going to hide these curtains, because with the curtains on, with the reflectivity and translucency, my render's gone from about 1.5 minutes to about 4 or 5 minutes. So why render if you don't need to? So I'm just going to Control H and hide those. Then I'm going to select the bed here and assign a new VRay material to it. So I'm just going to right mouse click, of course, and assign new material, and basically just a standard VRay material that we'll then put into this VRay blend material up here. So let's create the first material, and let's call this bed base wood. Okay, we'll come up here and we'll add a diffuse texture, which will just be a wooden texture. Now I'm not going to really play around with this material too much because it's just there to be seen through the scratches. So there is no real need to make it a work of art. I'm going to apply that like so, and that's a little large, so I'll need to repeat that texture. I'll also turn down the filter. And remember, because I'm using a gamma corrected display here, I'm going to need to gamma correct this texture. So as we did before, just VRay texture input gamma, go down and tell VRay that this is an sRGB texture. There we go. So that's all looking fine, and I'm going to go into the Place 2D node and just repeat the U and V a few times. Now, like I said, this doesn't really need to be a work of art, because it's just going to be the texture that shows up underneath the scratching. But let's get a look at it. And my viewport has been playing silly buggers with me, which is why this texture looks a bit ropey. Hopefully on yours it will look better, but right now I actually know that this is the effect that I want. I could of course do a quick test render, but should be unnecessary for this. So that's basically the bottom layer created. Now normally if I was going to do a wood, I'd want some reflectivity on there, but as this is going to be the base layer and really it's just little scratches that will appear through, I'm actually not going to bother with the reflection. It'd be a waste of render time, you'd never notice it. Now if I had a scratch map that included a big chunk of paint missing, then of course I would do the reflection color and the reflection amount the same way I did the floor, but for this shouldn't really be an issue. So now we've got this bed base wood color. We also need the gloss paint that's going to go on top of the wood. So let's assign another new material to this bed, and again just a standard VRay material. I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to make the diffuse color white for a white gloss paint, but I don't want it completely white, so I'll use a kind of off-white eggshell color, sort of. This color should be about fine. I don't want too much, just ever so slightly off-white, and this will be the major thing we see on this bed, so we'll need some reflection. So let's go to a reflection amount of 0.5 and a reflection color of white. That's going to be fairly reflective, and then I want to blur those reflections by about 0.9 for reflection glossiness. Now the lower this is, the blurrier your reflections are going to get. The other thing is you want to make sure use Fresnel is ticked and lock Fresnel IOR to reflection is not ticked. The index of reflection for a gloss paint should be around 3 or 4. I'm going to put mine at 2 because I want it less reflective. I want to create a slightly kind of muddier feel to this, as it's, you know, it's supposed to be an old bed, an old scratch bed. The index of reflection for metal, for instance, would be anywhere from 20 upwards. So, you know, it's that thing. You can look up index of reflection for materials on Google. There's plenty of charts that will tell you what it's supposed to be. And you don't always have to be accurate, because obviously the index of reflection on an old gloss paint that's been worn down will be different to one on a brand new gloss paint. So basically we've just got this slightly eggshell color with 0.5 in reflectivity, 0.9 in glossiness, and 2 in IOR. Now, the other thing is these reflection subdivs. At the moment, 8 is going to be fairly low quality because the settings we have set here, but that's fine for right now. As I said, we'll come back and see what needs more quality when we do the final render. For right now, I don't want to be slowed down. So I'm going to now add a VRay blend material to this bed. In fact, I'll just name this so we know what it is, and I'll call this bed gloss paint. Okay, so when we go to the hypershade to drag them into the blend material, we know what we're actually doing, and assign new material. So VRay blend material. Okay, there we go, there it is. And for this, I'm going to open up the hypershade, which I've actually got situated down here. Go to materials, and this is going to need a base coat, which in our case will be our base wood, and it's going to need a material top coat. So I'm just going to save the scene there, because last time, this is actually the second time I've recorded this, last time it had a hiccup on me here, so I'm just making doubly sure. I'm going to middle mouse drag the bed base coat into there, and I'm going to middle mouse drag the bed gloss coat into the coat material. So this will overlay one on top of the other. Now, unfortunately, in my viewport, it's not updated, so this is not really going to support me being able to show you in real time, but I will do enough renders so you can see what's going on. So now we've got the base coat. The blend amount would be, you know, the amount of blending that goes on between the two coats. So if I were to say put this at white and render, so let's just take a snapshot of that in case we need it later. So with the blend amount set to white, the coat is going to show through completely. If the blend amount was set to black, then the base material would show through completely, and if it was set to half and half, they'd kind of mix together. I can illustrate this a little better if I come in and use just a checkerboard texture here and hit render. You'll see this actually checkers out quite nicely. So you'll see patches of white and patches of brown where the checker is actually white. The gloss material will show through where the checker is black. The base coat will show through. So I'll give this a minute and I'll get back to you. Okay, so with the black and white checker on there, we get what we expected to see. Wherever there was a black checker, we get the base coat coming through, and whenever there was a white checker, we get that white gloss paint coming through. So if we wanted to create a lovely distressed, scratched up old wooden bed, this is a nice way to go. It allows me now to apply the scratch map where we've got the checker map, and all should be well. But that's going to hit a snag, which I will go through with you. So let's add our scratch texture. Okay, so just a file texture, and let's pop that one in there. So as you can see, I've got 3 of these, as we saw first of all, 1, 2 and 3. Now in Maya 2015, I should just be able to load the first one, give it a UV tiling mode, and in my case this is UDIM, Mari. And you know, this will then link all 3 together, and I should be good to go. Fantastic. Nothing to it really. So let's just hit screen cap and render, and we should get a lovely scratched bed. Okay, but as you can see, this has just not worked. What it's done is it's just used 1 tile, even though it says it finds 3. And if I were actually to place this texture on a kind of standard VRay material, which I'll do now just so you can see. So let's assign a new material to our bed here, and let's just call it a VRay material, which we'll call junk, just so we know we are not using it. And then what I'll do is load that texture into the diffuse color. So once again, file, let's load this into the diffuse color, and I'll pick number 1. I will tell the UV tiling that it's Mari, and I'll hit generate preview. Okay, and it's really only finding that 1 texture for me. Now that normally would work. I'm not quite sure if that's my viewport. Let me just flick it over to refresh it. No, so you see, the problem with this is that it often works for me most of the time, and then some of the time it doesn't work. And it's also not backwardsly compatible with Maya 2014 and below. So, you know, I've had some issues with it, and I wanted to tell you a way around it. Now, if I were to render this, this would probably render okay this time, even though this one did not. Let's just see what this one renders in like, just to check that's not a viewport error. So, I mean, there you go. That's simply not working as it should, and it's strange because it's worked for me in the past, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. So I'm going to show you the way to do this in older versions of Maya, but also the way to do this if this gives you some grief. You know, it's very easy to do by hand anyway, so it's not really a big deal. What we need to do is go into the hyper shade, and I'm just going to clean up that with this little clean clear graph icon, and I'm going to use a standard Maya layered texture for this. So if I just type layer up here, you'll see I have this layered texture. So let's come in here with our layered texture, and what I need to do is load in 3 file textures with all my 3 scratch maps on. So get rid of this layer, go to 2D textures, and 1, 2 and 3. So I've got 3 file textures and 3 place texture nodes here. And let me just move these about. Okay, so now I'm going to load in each individual scratch map texture. I'm going to come here, scratch map 1, and I'm going to come here, scratch map 2, and I'm going to come here, scratch map 3. Okay, so that's all of my scratch maps connected together. Now I need to go to my layered texture, and this block here is just the initial material that's assigned to it. So I'm going to pop in material number 1, material number 2, and I'm just middle mouse dragging here, material number 3, and then I'll delete this. Okay, so the blend mode at the moment is set to over. It needs to be set to add, because we want to add these together. And you notice my tile here is going extremely white, so we'll need to fix that. If we go into the file texture and scroll down, under color balance you'll see default color. Just set it to black. Okay, now if I double click, hopefully this will update. No, it won't, but even though it's showing as white there, it should be fine when it comes to render time. So let's just make sure I've got all of those. There we go, there we go, there we go. And now we need to tell the Place 2D texture nodes where these should go. So we need to turn off Wrap U and V on all of these Place texture nodes. And we need to tell these which UV position they're in. Now this one's in 0, this one is in 1 because it's the second image, and this one is in 2. Okay, now that should be just about ready for us. So if we create, or actually we'll take a look at this VRay material we have here, and into the diffuse color we can just drag this layered texture. Okay. Now that's probably not going to display very well in the viewport, but let's give it a render and we'll see if we get an improvement on this. Okay, perfect. There is my working scratch map. So, you know, what should have been a simple case of going into Maya and flicking this down to UV tiling mode to Mari, because I worked in Mari. You can also ZBrush and Mudbox, and I have to say most of the time that works just fine. Occasionally it just for some reason won't do it for me. So there you go, that's how to do it by hand. If you're using 3 UV patches or 3 textures for your UV patches, you just load them all in as file textures, and then you simply need to turn off the Wrap U and Wrap V. You need to tell the translate frame where the UV is at. Now if that's not making much sense to you, if we check out the UVs for this bed, it hopefully will make more sense. If I go to the UV texture editor, so edit UVs, UV texture editor, you can see my UVs here. And let me zoom out and so, you know, this is space 0, this is space 1, and this is space 2, which corresponds to our hypershade of 0, 1, and 2. So this technique, if you've never done this before, just allows you to use something like Mari or ZBrush or, you know, a few other packages now. It allows you to paint textures bigger than you would normally be able to. If you wanted, say, a 32K texture, an extremely massive texture, you can now split that up into 2K textures, feed them all into Maya, and it will work with them just fine. Whereas, you know, a 32K texture on its own is just not going to be very feasible. It's a bit unwieldy. So, you know, we do this, and now we've got this layered texture, which we can feed in to a material and get this, 3 textures applied to 1 object. Okay, so now let's go back to our VRay blend material. So we got this VRay blend material here, which I should probably call bed blend material. There we go, just so I know where I'm at. And now we can use the blend amount instead of the checkered pattern that we had on there. We can just use our layered texture as the blend amount. There we go. So you can see that's connected the texture out color to blend amount. And now when I render, instead of this black and white, I should get my gloss paint on the top and my wood coming through. So I'll just hit render and I'll be back with you in just 2 secs. Okay, so there we go. There is our bed with the wood underneath. Now the wood's quite dark, but that's exactly how I wanted it. It's not, you know, perhaps that much wood in here, so if you wanted to, you could obviously scratch a bit more of this top paint off, and if you compare it with this black one, you can actually see that the wood underneath is pretty warm, and we've got this semi-reflective glossy surface on the top here, which we'll obviously get a better look at when we do a higher quality render. But for right now, you know, all we had to do was create one of these layered textures out of our 3 patches. And then a blend material, our bed blend material, which is basically the gloss paint, the wooden paint, So you'll see our gloss paint is not connected to any textures. So if we wanted to, we could come into the diffuse gloss paint and put some brush strokes in there, and again that would facilitate you having to get really up close to the bed. So it depends how much the bed is going to figure in the shot. If you were kind of doing a shot of the bed from sort of here, then you might want to put some actual paint strokes in the paint, but again I'll leave that to you. It's very easy to just add some wrinkles and the diffuse color for the paint. And then we've got the bed base, which is connected to our wooden file texture. And then we've got the blend material, which takes the bed base as the base material, the gloss paint as the coat material, and uses our scratch map here, which is in our layered texture, to define where the scratches are. Now, you could have just painted this texture, of course, but right now, if I decide that this wooden color on the top needs to be slightly, say, oranger or slightly greener even, or if I decide the material underneath is not sort of a mahogany, but more of a chipboard, it becomes very easy with this blend material to come in and just change the base coat, change the top coat without having to repaint the entire texture. So when we come back, we'll look at doing these back curtains, because there's a little trick with a sampler info and facing ratio nodes, with the facing ratio of a sampler info node that I want to cover with you to create a sort of velvety curtain look. I also will probably finish up this bed with a bit of a bump map, but for right now I'll go ahead and add the curtains back in, get a render of the bed with the curtains in for the next part. So I thank you again for watching, and I hope you've learned something interesting. Cheers. Hi, welcome back. In the last part we finished off here, and I've done a slightly larger render with the curtains back on the bed. Now I'll probably end up going with an even finer weave than this. If you'll remember, we changed it once, but again it's down to personal preference more than anything. And our bed now is looking fairly nice. Now before we go any further with these back curtains or some simple bump for the bed, I just want to have a look at the lighting we've got, because now we've got some more elements back in our scene here. We're kind of blocking a lot of this lighting. Now it would be a fairly trivial matter to make this a little brighter in post. So, it depends on the effect you're going for, but just for experimentational purposes, I've changed the lights in this scene, or the main directional light, which we're using for sunlight, a little bit. So here's where we left it. I then flipped it round so it was pointing in the opposite direction. So rather than the light coming in from the sky here, as it is in this shot, I've just flipped it, and I've also rotated the HDR a little bit so it's not so bright outside the window. So instead of being backlit, we're now front lit, and again this depends entirely on what you want on your scene. And then for a final change, I changed the color of the directional light a little bit. So we went to this, so it's more of a blue, and I believe it's more in keeping with the light outside. Now you can see the directional light here, so it used to be pointed the other way. All I've done is flipped it round, and that took us from kind of this to this, and then changing the light color just added an overall note of blue. And I got this light color by basically opening up the color swatch, clicking the pipette here, and picking one of these blue colors outside. I then just made it a little bit lighter. Okay, so that's how I got the blue color for the inside of my room, and again that will be dependent on what color you have outside, really. So what I'd like to go over in this part of the tutorial is just getting some textures on everything else in this room. Now there'll be nothing too complicated. We'll be using basically the VRay bog standard material, and I'll finish off in another part with the glass parts of these lamps and anything that might be a little trickier, maybe some metallic shaders for these kind of wall lamps here. But let's just get all our ducks in a row with pertaining to the rest of this scene. And one of the first things I wanted to show you was how to create a nice fall off for a kind of velvety cloth. So I'll go into the layer editor and just turn off those elements there, and actually that'll also end up hiding my curtains. So what I'll do is just come in, and I just want to hide anything that might take a lot of extra time to render. So there we go, just Control H those away. Okay, and we'll want to look at these curtains. Now I want a standard VRay material for these for a start, so I'm just going to go to Assign New Material, and I'm going to use this standard VRay material here. And now the problem with this is that to get a velvety color, I want very bright highlights, kind of diffuse big highlights over this cloth. So, just changing the color here to, I would go for a sort of brownish reddish, sort of a brownish reddy color like so, isn't going to do it. I can use reflectivity to get it done, but again, it's going to take longer to render. If I was using Max, I could use a fall off curve, but unfortunately there isn't a simple way, or as simple way, to do that in Maya. So I'm going to show you a technique that I used to like for cloth, well, still like for cloth. So if we pop open the Hypershade, instead of using a solid color, we're going to use a ramp. So if we grab our VRay material that we just made there, and we call this, let's say, back drapes, so we know where we are. What I want to do is put a color ramp on this. So if you go to 2D textures, there we go, you'll find ramp somewhere here. There we go. So I can put a ramp on the color node, the diffuse color node of this. So I can just drag this ramp in here, and then pop it open and give it some colors. Now I'm going to create a selection of most hideous colors here, just because it will make it easy to illustrate what's happening. So it's like kind of a purplish, pinkish, and a green. And that's not going to get it done, is it? That's just not going to be what we want. So in order for me to get a sharper color towards the camera and darker as it goes away into these kind of creases, I'm going to bring up a sampler info node. So if I go under Utilities and scroll down, I'll find under S sampler info. There we go. So one of these. Now I'm going to take this and attach it to our ramp. So I'm just going to middle mouse drag this up here and go, whoops, that was not the right one. Middle mouse drag this up here and hit other. And I'm going to take the facing ratio of the sampler info node. So where are we? There we go. And I'm going to attach it to the UV coordinates of this ramp. And now if we look in our viewport, you'll see that the whole curtain has just gone green. So let's just come in here and play with this ramp a little bit. And you'll see I'm not really getting an update in the viewport. So let me just flick this back from viewport 2. Let me just flick this into viewport 2. Apologies, I'll obviously put it back to the legacy viewport at some point. Okay, and once again, I'm not really getting that viewport update that I should be getting. So let's take a quick render and see where we are. Because sometimes the viewport with the graphics cards I have is not that great at updating, but hopefully a quick render will show us where we're going. Okay, so now you can kind of see our two colors. We've got the green in here and the purple here. What I'm going to activate is VRay's RT, because VRay is real-time render, as we looked at before. Because for something like this, it can be somewhat of a huge benefit. So I'll just change the image size down to half, and I'll go up to IPR and select the whole image. And now, whoops. Now we can change this ramp and get a real-time look at it. So just wait for VRay to load in the textures and build the light cache. Okay, there we go, and that should now start rendering. Okay, so now I can come in and tweak this ramp. So for instance, I can put another green here and move this one up. And come on, and we're back to building the light cache. if you have better graphics cards than me, which hopefully most of you will, especially if you're going to be doing a lot of VRay RT, this is not my normal machine I'm working on, so this will be much faster for you. And I can just play around now with these ratios between the colors. So if I pull this one down a little bit, and I can start to see this purple is where I'm going to want the lighter color, and where the green is, that's where I'm going to want the darker color. So I can move in here and make this the sort of lightest brown. So this will be my lightest color, and I can come in now and start to make a darker color out of this. Okay, and just give VRay a second to build the light cache. Normally it doesn't take this long, so I've probably got my light cache settings a bit high. And you can start to see this material is now beginning to look somewhat like velvet. I would probably take this top one and make it a bit lighter. And maybe push this one in a bit. And what we'll need now is maybe even lighter still here for a bit more contrast on these front-facing kind of lighter bits, but we shall see. Actually, this is looking pretty good in this little RT window. So I'll just stop this. And I'm going to need a bump map, some sort of brushed velvety type of bump map. So if I come in here and take a look at this material, so material attributes, and I scroll down the VRay material till we get to its bump, and the map, I'll just load in some kind of fabric-y texture that I have. So let me just find out which one of these is my fabric texture. Okay, so I've got a fabric bump map here that will do the job quite nicely. Now it'll be too big, so I'm going to stick it on there and then repeat its U and V. Now if we want to see how many times we need to repeat its U and V, we can of course just put it in the diffuse color slot, and that will give us a look at what it looks like on the material. So let's move these things around so we can figure out what's where. Okay, and file 15, this is our bump map, so let's drag that into the diffuse color slot. Okay, and that shows us what size our bump map is going to be. Now I'm going to want a smaller size than that, so let's go up to our place 2D texture node for the bump map and make the repeat U and V say 10 and 10. That's still probably a bit big, so let's try 20 and 20. That should be about fine for what I want it for. I just want to give a bumpy sort of velvety feel to the whole thing. So, that's good. I know that 20 and 20 is about right now. So we'll go back to our original VRay material and just pull the ramp back in the diffuse color. Now, because we've changed this 2D texture node on the bump, which we never unconnected, that will still be at 20 and 20. So if we look here, let's just change this ramp slightly, because I get the feeling that this could do with being just a tad lighter. Maybe like so, and we'll see on a render. The other thing is that bump is probably going to be quite harsh, so if we select the original material, which for some reason should be called back drapes, but there we go, and come down to the bump and change the bump multiplier to say 0.1, should be more than enough. Okay, now I'll take a real render of these curtains and we'll get a look at what they like, what they're like with the material we've just put on. So I'll just kidnap this one and hit render. So there's a very small kind of fast test render of what it looks like. Now I'm pretty happy with that color, sort of a sumptuous golden brown, and that facing ratio on the ramp has created these areas of high contrast here. It helps us make it look more like velvet, and obviously when we get a bigger, better quality render, you'll be able to see more of the contribution from that bump map. But for now, I'm fairly happy with that. And this kind of setup where we use a ramp connected to a sampler info node, which is connected to the facing ratio, back into the ramp and then into the diffuse color channel, is useful for all sorts of things. I kind of urge you to have a play around with it as well. It's handy to use in the reflection color slot if you've got a very reflective material, but it's just one tip that I personally use quite a bit. Now I'm just going to set my test resolution back up to 75%, and I'm going to bring back all the objects in my scene, because what I want to do now is just finish off the bulk of the materials, and most of this is pretty simple stuff. It's just assigning the wallpaper to these walls. So I'm going to run through this pretty quickly. So let's just assign new material, VRay material, and attributes, and we'll call this back wallpaper, and I'm basically just using file textures for these things. So let's come in, file texture, and there is my back wallpaper. Okay, it's too big at the moment, as you can see, so let's come in and first let's just change its effects to 0.1. Now that would be to change the effect of that quadratic filter up there. Let's make sure we put a VRay texture input gamma on there, because we'll need to tell VRay that this is an sRGB image. So VRay extra attributes, sRGB, done. And we'll also need to repeat the U and V a bit because it's a bit big. So if we go into the place 2D texture node and repeat U and V, say 15 times, that should do it. I can see there the pattern's at a reasonable size. So that's that wallpaper taken care of. Let's come over here to this wall, assign a new material, and again VRay material and light wallpaper. And same thing here, pretty simple procedure. So just up to file, and let's come in here, and I've got another wallpaper that I like to use, and there we go. That looks pretty good as is, really. So couch, again, I'm going to use a file texture, but I'm also going to use a bump map. So I'm going to come in, and if I get closer to this couch, I would eventually use the displacement, but as we're going to be shooting it from quite far away, it's actually not so important. So I'm going to come in here, I'm going to once again go for file. Whoops, that did not work. What happened there? Okay, what I've done is I forgot to assign a new material. Sorry, I'm obviously having some problem. And yeah, let's just flip that up. There we go. So apologies, assign new material first, of course. And I'm just going to call this couch. So I've got another file texture. And let's see, couch, there it is. So that's the one I'm going to be using for the couch. Now don't remember to add the texture input gamma. So sRGB, and again on this wallpaper I don't think I remembered to add the input gamma for the texture. So let's come and do that now. And sRGB. So that's most of the main shading done. We've got some bedside tables and these door frames and skirting boards and whatnot, but this should give us, if I do a quick render for you guys now, this should give us an idea of the light levels, because before we had fairly white walls. Now we've got colored walls, which is going to bounce light differently. So whenever I make huge changes on surface areas that are this large, I like to take a quick render just to make sure that my light levels are still acceptable and everything is kind of how I expect it to be. So I'm going to come in now and do that quick render, and I will see you in a second. Okay, so overall this is not looking too bad. Now you can see we've got some extreme grain going on throughout this image because of our low quality settings. But we've got a render time of 1 minute 37 seconds, so I wouldn't really expect miraculous quality at that speed. The nice thing is though, we can get a look at overall light levels with the new controls in Maya 2015. I can kind of do a little bit of post work just to see what I could get in Photoshop later on and how exposed the image is and whatnot. So I'm going to now, in between the parts, go and basically just add a wooden file texture to this table, and add the rest of the texture to the couch. So overall, I'm happy with these curtains. They've got like a metallic-y look to them, and we've got no reflectivity on them whatsoever, so they render in really nice and quickly. And when we come back, I'll go through the materials I finished off. We'll touch upon anything that might be a little more complicated than the norm, so metallic textures, or in this case metallic shaders, and we'll look at bringing the bed back in, cranking the quality settings up. We'll look at VRay's render elements, and then we'll look at compositing the image together in Photoshop, because I don't want to do a extremely large and complicated composite on this one. I just want to give you enough information so we can go into Photoshop with our 32-bit images and get cracking. So I hope you found something in this part that was of interest, and I shall see you in the next part. Thanks for watching. Hi, welcome back. Since the last part, I've made a few extra material tweaks. Now, there was nothing particularly complicated that was done. I've changed the colour of these room elements here, the door frames and the wall panels and whatnot. And basically, I'll open up the materials that I've created during the break just so you can have a look. And this is basically just a diffuse colour that's sort of an off-white. It's got a Ward reflection type, BRDF type. Now, Fong would be a very tight specular highlight, Blinn somewhere in the middle, and Ward quite a loose specular highlight. And as this was gloss paint, I wanted a looser spec. It's got a reflection glossiness of 0.9, so the reflections will be slightly smudged, and it's got a fairly high amount of reflectivity on it. So this will give us a somewhat reflective paint surface. Now, the things like the bedside cabinets just have pretty much a similar technique that we used on the floor applied to them, and it's just a painted texture that's on them. Now, this lamp here has quite an interesting shader on it, so if I just bring that up, you'll see that it's got a diffuse color that's mapped to a texture, which is just at the moment this one, which creates this kind of stained glass pattern. Now, this yellow blob in the corner here is because how the UVs are laid out. So the inside of the lamp will actually render yellow. So, I mean, if you want to see that, I'll just bring it up in the UV editor. So you can see there's the outside of the lamp in white there, and there's the inside of the lamp. So, this yellow blobbiness here was just for the inside lamp color, or the inside lamp shade color. Now, if we continue to look at the material, you can see it's slightly transparent. And rather than using the same combination of translucency and transparency I used on the curtains, what I did was go down to refraction, and I used VRay's fog color. Now, this will allow you to create some fairly nice colored glass effects. So I've simply fed the same texture back into the fog color and turned the fog multiplier up to 2. So, nothing really to it. The wood, again, on this base piece was created in a very similar manner to the wooden floor. All the rest that's happened is basically just these metallic style lampshades. And these are really quite easy to create if you've never created anything metallic before. I started off with copper and didn't like the look of it, but you can create pretty much any color you want. What you want for a metal is a pretty dark, diffuse color. So if you want silver, I'd pick a dark gray, and then I make that a lighter reflection color with an amount of 1. It really is pretty simple. I use a high IOR, and that will give me a very basic metal. If I'd have wanted this in chrome, I would have made this very dark gold color, and this a light. If I'd have wanted this in not chrome, in copper, I'd have made this very dark sort of gold color and this very light gold color. And because I want my metal to be slightly burnished or brushed even, I have a reflection glossiness of 0.95. I've also turned the reflection subdibs up to 32, so we get some quality on there. And this is pretty much all I've changed between the parts. I just went round and added some very simple materials to some of the more tedious bits of the room. Now I've also added a standard bitmap texture to this bed, so it really is just this pattern. So we come up and have a look at that, and I'll show you the texture that I used. It's just this applied onto the bed, nothing clever there at all. Now I'm not really using a bump map on this because I'm never going to get close enough to the bed for a bump map to be that visible on the cloth. However, if you were shooting from here, you might want to look at a cloth pattern bump map, same way we did for the curtains. So, you know, again, I tend to keep things as simple as possible for the size of render I'm going to do. Obviously, if I'm rendering out in 10K or 5K or something extreme like this, then you're going to need a lot more detail. But as I'm going to be doing sort of a 2K max render, and everything's going to be sort of so far away, then the hyper detailing doesn't really need to be added right now. Same with the sofa, you know, it's just a bitmap texture. So really, that was it for texture in our room, and I have noticed a couple of things while I've been flying around that I've missed. I've missed these buttons on the bed. So if I have a look under my bed model, the buttons are all stored in this group. So I'll just add a standard VRay material to these buttons and give them a dark red color. Okay, so I'll go some sort of dark red. There we go. Okay, and the same thing with these cushions. I specifically left sort of not quite finished because you might notice that I've changed the color on our curtain material slightly. I haven't actually done anything different to it. I've just gone into the ramp that we have connected to that sampler info and just desaturated this goldy color a little bit. So as I come over here, you know, I wanted to just show you a quick trick that most of you, I'm guessing, will know, but if you don't, it's a handy thing to know. If we go to hyper shade, and I want these cushions to have that same facing ratio trick that those curtains have, I can actually just come up to our curtains, which, let me just see what I call those, back drapes, that's it, and graph the network here in the hyper shade. Click here, pop it out by selecting this input and output connections, grab its VRay material shading group and go edit, duplicate, shading network, and this will give me a duplicate one. So now I've got a duplicate one. I can go in and give it a name, couch C01, and then just change the color, and that duplicates the sampler info, the ramp, and the bump map we were using, so I don't have to rehook all those things up. So I'm going to come in here and I'll just make this one a little lighter, maybe a little more towards this kind of color, and let's just pull this down a notch. Okay, so that can do for one cushion. So I'll just select these cushions here, 1, 2 and 3, and I'm just shift selected in the viewport, and I'll go assign material to selection. So that puts one on. Now we can just grab this one, once again edit, duplicate, shading network. Okay, and you'll see here I have a couch cushion 02, so graph that out, select its ramp again, and just change this to whatever color you think might suit the cushions on your sofa. So for me, I think I'll go for more of a browny color, and darker, and maybe a little more saturated here. Let's have a look. Get a color you're happy with. I'm not going to spend too long with this one. Alright, so that will do. So select these other two white cushions and just assign existing material and couch 02. Okay, so that's created two fairly unstandard materials with those sampler info nodes on them in fairly short order. So really that's the scene pretty much done in terms of texturing. Now you can of course spend a lot more time on this, putting some extra detailing into everything, but for me, as far as the tutorial goes, I'm probably not going to do much more texture work on this. I have reduced the size of the wallpaper a smidgen by repeating the U and V, and I've reduced the size of this wallpaper here. Which brings us on to our next point, quality. Because, in the last part, we pretty much looked at the basic lighting setup. We looked at, getting the GI from the outside inside. So if I bring this render up, you can see I've slightly moved the position of the HDR. You can see the ground over here, but there's no trees in the background. And that's because I wanted to put the sun right behind us, which has led to a little bit more light coming in here, which I thought was nice. I've, basically done nothing other than that, and just kind of finished texturing these big blocks here. The problem with this is, if I put the gamma back to 1 where it should be, it's a little dark. And there's a few things that we can do about that. We can, of course, just increase the strength of our lights, but doing that sometimes will create sort of bright hotspots. So let's go and increase the strength of the lights to start with. So let's look at our directional light first, because this is not giving me anything that's overly bright as it strikes the ground. So I'm going to be able to increase that a little bit. And I'll go from 5 to 8. And most of the light in the scene is being provided by the dome light HDR. So let's go to the dome and put that from, say, 5 to 10. Let's see if we can get away with that. And all these rectangular lights, well, they're just helping to pump a bit of light and color information in, so we can't actually increase the intensity of these. But what we can do is go to the dome light and come up here, attributes. Let's find its texture, sorry. So go to the dome light texture, which is our HDR, and attributes VRay, and let's go texture input gamma. Looks like I already had one on there. And what I'm going to do is to increase the contrast in this. I'm going to set its gamma from 1, because it's a linear image, to say 0.7. That will make the HDR itself lighter and slightly increase the contrast on it, so it should flood more light into the room. So basically we've turned our lights up a little bit, both the directional one and the dome light, and we've also made our HDR a little lighter. Now this will make it look a little strange in the window, but we're actually not going to use the HDR as the picture here that's in the background. It's generally not good practice to use your light in HDR for your background. I mean, you can do it, it works in a pinch. And sometimes though it adds a little unflexibility, and because we're going to be taking this out and compositing it in Photoshop, I'm going to show you how to put any background in here that you want. So, making this a little bit lighter won't really have that much effect in terms of the look, other than it will brighten up the overall illumination. So I'm just going to kidnap this image and do a quick render, and we'll take a look at this when that render's finished. You might have also noticed that I kept threatening to tighten up the weave on these curtains, and indeed I have. And again, that was just Photoshop with that texture we designed a few parts ago. So I'm just going to hit render, and I'll be back in a tick. Okay, welcome back. So that took 20 minutes compared to the previous 14 minutes. So lightening up a bit added a tad to render time. But as you can see, it lightened it up quite considerably. More than enough for me to feel okay with it, to be honest with you. Now, you can continue to lighten it up in any way you want. Basically, you can keep increasing the intensity on your directional light or your dome light and just kick in more light there into the scene. But for me, I'll be able to take this into Photoshop in a second and get that as light as I want it. I prefer more kind of moody atmospheric shot even in the daylight. I don't think it would be much lighter than this with that curtain drawn and these heavy drapes across this window and the sun coming in from behind us. But anyway, that's down to you. The one thing I want to look at now is quality, because you can see we're fairly grainy in this image here. So I want to eliminate some of this grain, but again, I don't want render time to shoot up. For me, if I'm going to render this out as, say, a standard HD image, then I'm going to want to look at a render time of around a couple of hours, 3 hours, 4 hours maximum. I've seen some renders that take a bit longer, but they tend to be, with a lot of complicated translucency and transparency and subsurface scattering and stuff. And to be honest, I can live with a little bit of grain. Generally, when I take an image into post-production, one of the first things I'll do when it's almost complete is, I'll slap some grain on it. So, trying to get this completely smooth, to my mind, is a bit of a waste of time. But again, that will depend entirely on what you're going for. But for me, this is too much grain. So I'm going to leave a little bit, I'm going to take a little bit out. So first things first, we can increase the quality of stuff that probably needs it. Like these curtains, they're very translucent, they're very transparent. So let's take a look at them and see if we can tweak individual elements. This is generally faster than telling the whole scene that it needs a ton of extra quality. So let's come into our bed drapes material and just set our refraction subdivs, which we can find here, up to 16. Okay, I'm going to do that pretty much with anything with a lot of refraction on it. So these back curtains, I don't believe that they have any, but I'll just check them. Let's see. No, they've got no refraction on them. The color is black, so they're just using translucency to get this, so that should be fine. Now, highly reflective areas like our floor, you can see our bed kind of being reflected in it, which is a little bit grainy. But to be honest, that's sort of okay for me. But if you did want to kind of up the quality of that, you can always go into its material attributes, come down, and it's a reflective surface, the floor. So we're going to go find reflection, and we'll increase those reflection subdivs to 16 too. Now, let's look at the VRay settings. And, we basically lowered these settings quite a bit, seeing as we have, test renders on the way. So let's kick them up to what they normally start out as. So I can turn this adaptive amount to 8.5, and this threshold, very important for controlling noise. I'm going to put this at 0.5. I'm going to leave the adaptive min samples to 8 and see if I can get away with that. The more this is increased, the slower everything will go. I'm going to turn these up to 16, which will help us out with the anti-aliasing, and again I'm going to drop to 0.5. Now, if we look under GI, I'm going to increase the subdivs on my light cache to 2000. I'm also going to turn use ray trace threshold back on, and as I go up, I can use a few more subdivs on my irradiance map. And let's just check here. Okay, we have use embry ticked, which should speed things up a little bit. And let's see, I think this is probably all the quality tweaking I'm going to do. Now, you can tweak this to get less noise, and we might have to. So what I'll do is a few test renders in this noisy area and see if we need to do anything. And the other thing I wanted to mention was this color mapping. So I'm going to set mine to don't affect colors, only adaptation, or at the very least no gamma. When we save this image out, what we're going to want is a clean image out of VRay and Maya. I don't want it monkeyed around with in any way, shape or form. I don't want the VRay applying gamma to it. I don't want anything done to it. I will do all the correction for color and gamma myself. So that will ensure that I get the full range of information out of VRay and into my post-processing app. It also makes sure I get a proper linear workflow out of Maya, because obviously at the moment our image is gamma corrected. So, as soon as you open a 32-bit image in Photoshop, it will be gamma corrected again. So we want to make sure that we've got, definitely not color mapping and gamma, but don't affect colors, only adaptation, or color mapping only, no gamma. Either one will do in this case. Alright, so anything else we might have missed? Let's see. So this is all looking pretty good. Let's go up to the GI and just check through it. Okay, we have use ray trace threshold on. Okay, Our preset is medium animation, which is generally fine for a still like this. You can flick that to high if you want. And let's just check under the settings. So we've got a max 32 subdivisions for our smooth cloth and things, and it looks pretty smooth to me, so that's also okay. Now, render elements we'll come to in just a second, but right now let's snapshot this and let's get a render of this region here and see if we've cleaned up any of that grain. Okay, so if I just zoom in here a little bit, you can see this is the new one. Now it's still a tad grainy, but if I flick backwards and forwards, you can see there was the old one, which is actually horrendously grainy, and now we've knocked a lot of that off. We start to get some definition in here. So, you know, we've looked at the VRay quality settings and we've tweaked excuse me, let me just get rid of that. We've tweaked a few of the settings. Now, before we go nuts with these settings and start lowering this down and cranking this up, we need to look at anything else we can change the subdivisions on individually. And one of the big culprits for this kind of grain is generally on your dome light. So if we select our dome light here, and we just scroll up, you'll be able to see we've got a subdivs of 8. Now, if I crank that up to a very high number, 64, actually let's do 32. It's better to sometimes go, you know, only as much as you need, because everything you put in here is going to be an increase to render time. So what I'll do is I'll capture this image and I'll just re-render that little square. You'll also notice that the render time goes up because I've increased the subdivs on the dome light. Shouldn't be too bad. It might go to 2.5 minutes, but I'll be back in a second. Okay, so here's the new image, and it's got less grain on it. The effect wasn't quite as noticeable in this particular corner as I was hoping, but you could definitely see we've cut down a little bit of the grain. We made our definition sharper as I flick backwards and forwards. So what might be happening is it might be the low subdivs on our portal lights that are causing a little bit of grain to still be in there. I mean, the good news is that our render time only shot up a couple of seconds, so I might just crank the subdivs on this all the way up to 64 just to see what sort of time it adds and benefit. And I'm going to come to all of these rectangular lights we're using as portable lights and crank their subdivs up to 16. You could probably go higher, but again, I'm working on that principle that troubleshooting the problem in small increments is generally a better idea, I find. You know, and a lot of people are of the opinion that it is much easier just to crank these settings up to maximum. The problem I find with that is when you're rendering out a large scene with all those settings, you know, set massively high, you can wait, you know, days almost for a single render. And what I'll find is that mostly it's just one element that needs that extra quality, like a very reflective or a very transparent material that needs that extra quality. So changing the subdivs on the material, or indeed changing them on the lights, you know, it might take a bit longer and it might be more of a pain, but really it is quicker at the end of the day, and it will come with the more you use VRay, the more you'll be able to have a look and say, oh, okay, that grain is being caused, you know, by this light or that texture or this reflection. So, you know, just have a play around with this and you'll quickly come to find that you can get much faster renders by actually, you know, coming in and manually changing these on individual elements. But anyway, so we just increased this subdivs on our portal lights and jacked them up again on the dome light. So, and to be honest with you, this level of grain here is not actually too bad, but let's, you know, with those increased subdivs, take another pass at it. So I'm going to keep that image and I'm just going to re-render this little swatch. Okay, so that's eliminated some more noise. No real increase in render time now. Of course, that might change across a whole image. It might add another minute or two to the final thing. You know, and if you want, you can go in and increase the quality. So, this will be a big quality increase if we jack this to 16. The problem is then if we jack this to 32, let's do in fact no, because that's just going to take a very long time to render. So we can probably get it down a bit with the noise threshold here at 0.2 and 0.2, even as low as 0.1. And I might increase these to 12. And that will probably do it for me. So let's get a shot of what was a very grainy wall back here. And I'll just hit render on this, and we'll come back and we'll look and see if that cleaned it up any. Well, it will obviously have cleaned it up, but if it's cleaned it up enough, which I imagine, we will be fine now. Okay, so I've zoomed right in on this, which is why it's a bit pixely obviously, but you can see here where the box was. So we've got very, very pronounced grain if you look here, and then where we've done our cleanup settings, we've got this fairly clean image, which, to be honest with you, that's good enough for this particular shot. It's got a little bit of grain in it. Same here, this where we rendered out before, you can see here it's just way too noisy, and then here it looks absolutely fine. You can still see a hint of grain, but I quite like that in a shot anyway. So again, I said in post-production we normally put some grain in, but if you want to keep adding quality, then please, feel free. It depends on what you're looking to get out of the scene. So what I'm going to do next is we need to go over render elements in VRay, because right now we could render out a bigger version of this. It's a pretty decent looking shot, and basically, hey presto, you're done. You could take it into Photoshop, do a few tweaks and whatnot. But I want to show you how to get the 32-bit linear image out of VRay so we can do some proper compositing. And I want to show you how to put together the reflections, the refractions, the GI, the lights, so you can overlay one on top of the other on top of the other, which will give us much more precise control when we do our composite. So, you'll have control of things like the amount of reflection and the amount of refraction, and you'll be able to do things like increase the overall GI or increase the overall direct lighting directly from within Photoshop, which saves you, having to re-render a bunch of times, which is no fun for anyone really. So, unfortunately for us, it's not just quite as simple as a case of bunging a few of these in here, hitting render, and then opening Photoshop. We're going to have to tweak some of the materials to allow these passes to work correctly. I also want to show you how to measure out your depth pass, which is exceedingly simple if you know how, and also how to do an ambient occlusion pass, which is also a simple thing. So when we come back, we'll look at quickly picking out the right render elements for a simple composite, by which I mean the simplest way to pick out our GI and whatnot and put it back to get the beauty image. We'll also look at how to change the materials, so they're going to work with that. We'll look at how to replace this with a custom background, but in such a manner that if I were to put a big green tree in the background in Photoshop, I'd want to be able to see a big green tree through this curtain. So we'll be looking at all that kind of stuff. So I hope you found something interesting once again in this part. I will see you in the next part. Thank you very much for watching. Hi, welcome back. So in the last part we looked at increasing the quality of our render slightly. Of course that comes in at the cost of render time, more quality, more time it's going to take to render it out. So if we open up our render and have a look, this is still the one that's fairly grainy. I haven't had chance yet to do a full render with the new quality settings, but basically in this part I want to talk about getting this render out of Maya and into Nuke or After Effects, or in our case Photoshop, and I want to talk about getting it out of here with the most bang for the buck, by which I mean I want the most information I can possibly get. I want to see all of my scene elements broken down in, so direct light, GI, reflection, refraction, specular, stuff like this. So it will give me, a lot of information to do the composite. A lot of tweaks and changes will be possible. So if we go up and actually look at the render elements, I'll just describe to you a basic set of them. So if you come up to your render settings, render elements, I mean, at its most basic, and these are the ones that you can use to combine back into a beauty image. So this image here, we're going to want reflection, refraction, specular, global illumination, and VRay lighting. Now, if you've used caustics at all, kind of reflection patterns through glass, or if you've used self-illumination, you'll need those. But for us, we're going to do the basics. So reflection, refraction, and you'll see it puts them up here. Y is yes, you want them exported out, and if you click it, it goes to no. So we got reflection, refraction. Let's grab the specular and GI. You don't want the raw anything at this level. We just want the GI, and we want lighting. So that'll give us a basic set of passes. We haven't used any kind of self-illuminating materials in this scene, so there's no need to take anything else. Now, obviously, this can get seriously complicated. I want to keep this, fairly simple. Just enough information that we need to create, this image. So a few passes it's nice to have. Always depth of field, Z depth. And also I want an ambient occlusion pass. So you'll notice there isn't one here, but we can just fix that with an extra texture. And what an extra texture will allow us to do is tell VRay to render the entire scene with a texture. So basically we'll come up to extra texture and VRay attributes, give it a texture. In this case we want a ambient occlusion, so we'll use a VRay dirt. Okay, and that will render the entire scene with that shader applied to everything in it as a separate render element. That gives us our ambient occlusion. Now you can come off it here and play with the number of subdivs for the quality of the ambient occlusion, the radius of the ambient occlusion, and the fall off and whatnot. But for me, this will do right now. So that's basically all of our simple render elements. Now for Z depth, you'll see that the white depth is set to 1000. So basically we want the black depth to start here and the white depth to disappear off back here. So I need to make sure from my camera to the back of the scene how far it is away, and there's a really easy way to do this. I'll just bookmark this camera view, and so now my camera is about here, so I'll just create measure tools, distance tool, and you can take some more time with this, but that's about 1178 scene units. Okay, so I'm going to want the blackness to start just in front of the camera. So if we go back to our render elements, there we go, and look at this Z depth. I'm going to go for 1200 and black 25, and that should give me a Z depth, or a depth that can be used for things like depth of field and fog and all sorts of other interesting things later on. But handy to have one. So that's a full set of render elements. We've got the extra texture, which is currently handling our ambient occlusion. We've got GI, global illumination. We've got direct lighting. We've got reflection, refraction, specular, and Z depth. The problem is, if we just go to hit render now, in Maya's frame render view here, you won't be able to access those. You'd need to use VRay's frame buffer. And the other problem is that we're going to come up here, and when we hit render at the moment, okay, this refraction that's happening through this curtain, for instance, if we just save this in Photoshop and try to swap out the background, this refraction is always going to stay blue. So I've got to dome light shape, there we go, and what I want to tick is invisible, which will make this dome light invisible, so it will just be black. Now it will still have an effect on the scene, it will still be providing light, it just won't be visible through the window, which will allow us to slip another background in. So if I were to say re-render this, the scene would look exactly the same, except this would be black. The problem with that is that these curtains would then still have the refraction of this blue sky, and if I wanted to put an office block outside here, when I take this to composite, I'm going to have an office block with what looks like a transparent curtain looking out onto a blue sky, which is obviously just not going to get it done for us. So what we need to do is make sure that our dome light is on invisible, which, as I said, will just take the picture away. It won't actually affect the lighting. And then we need to go into anything where we have refraction. So these curtains, for instance. And if we look at their material attributes, so I go into its material. What I need is where it says affect channels, I'm going to flip this down to all channels. So before it was only really affecting the refraction was only affecting the color. Now it's going to affect all the channels, which basically means it's going to affect the alpha too. So I'm going to be left with alpha map on these curtains, which means if I put something behind them in Photoshop, obviously they'll be slightly transparent, so I'll be able to composite on any background I want, which is exactly kind of what I'm looking for. Now you'll need to do that with any material in the scene that has refraction. So if I look at this, for instance, this has some refraction on it, I believe. So refraction color, yeah. So affect all channels. Okay, so you know, when you build your own scene, or if you're rendering along with mine, if you've decided, you know, to make these curtains transparent as well for whatever reason, you're going to need to go in and do those. Basically anything with refraction, for this to work, is going to need to be set to all channels. Okay, so you know, that's a basic set of render elements. What I'll do is render this image out now, and we'll go into Photoshop and take a look at each one of these individual elements, how we can put them back together, and you know, why we'd want this much extra information. So before I go, however, and you know, render this, I've got to say that just going up to here and hitting render now won't do it. Okay, we're going to have to go up to take a look at our settings just to make sure we're on an image format capable of supporting 32 bits, which EXR is. Okay, and I just want to check once more that we have no gamma being applied to our final saved out image. This is on linear multiply, which is absolutely fine for what we're doing right now. And okay, so that's all the settings in there done. Now you might want to change the size of your image, because at the moment it's only 720, which is pretty small. So you know, I'll actually go and change the size of mine. I'll probably render out in extreme widescreen, but that's a preference because I'll be using it for the banners on the site. So you know, you might want to just click it up at least to 1024. Or sorry, 1080. There you go. You know, just to get out a bigger image. Anyway, entirely up to you. So that's basically all we need. Let's just make sure we've got all our elements, because there's nothing worse than setting off a 2-hour render only to find you've missed, you know, a whole bunch of stuff. No, and we look absolutely fine there. Okay, so to render that out, if I can't just go to here and hit this, what I like to do is just go to render. So I just press the space bar to bring up the hot box and render, batch render. And that will render out the image along with all the render elements. Now of course you might also want to check that you're not rendering out a huge animation. So start frame 1, end frame 1. If this was start frame 1 and end frame 1000, when you hit that batch render button, what you'd get is 1000 frames rendered out for your machine, which is probably in this case not what you want. So just make sure that that's there. I'll just save this scene. So I'll just call it part 8. Okay, and then just get your camera in a position where you like the shot and render, batch render, and you'll find all of your images in your project directory in the images folder. So I'll be back in a moment and I'll open up Photoshop and we'll take a look at putting all this together and getting out some sort of final image. Okay, so I open this up here, and as you can see, I'm in my VRay tutorial new directory, which is my project directory, and inside images I find all these images. Now this one will be the main image, the beauty, which we won't actually be using. You know, it's just there because VRay renders it out. And this is the shot that I took out of VRay. Now you'll notice mine still has a bigger wallpaper in, because I actually rendered this out yesterday. So, if you've probably got a few more tweaks than me, you've probably got smaller wallpaper and a slightly different color curtain, but the principle is exactly the same. So I've got this image. You'll notice, because we took the dome on invisible, it's not there anymore, but you'll also notice that I can see right through this curtain to the background, which means if I were to stick something in there now, so if we create a layer and just drag it behind, and I take the paint bucket and just get a red, don't suppose that matters much, and actually I'll need to move the image from 32 bits to 16 bits so we can work on it. There we go. And you'll notice as soon as I do that, it brings up the HDR toning. So, if you go image adjustments 16-bit, it will bring up the HDR toning. And if you see, this is my image, it's quite dark at the back. And if I hit preview on HDR toning, you'll see I can get all sorts of effects. That's because when we save this out as a 32-bit image without any gamma correction to it, or without any monkeying around in it, it gives us a massive leeway in what we can do with this image, how we can color it, how we can almost relight it. So your post-production possibilities go up massively if you're working with these 16-bit or 32-bit images. In this case, I'm going to leave it at the default. So click Method, Exposure and Gamma, and actually, I don't know why those are up there, but I believe by default that's just 1 and that's just 1. Okay. Actually, no, exposure is probably 0. Yeah, there we go. So this is just not doing anything to our image. It's simply now converting it to 16-bit. So, okay. Alright, so let's, again, because I had to merge those, bring in the layer and bung the red paint bucket on it. And you can see through my curtain here, red into the background, which is exactly what we were looking for. Which means now, if I use my office block analogy and put it out there, I'll be able to see the office block through it. Okay, but let's go one stage further. Let's bring in the passes, or in VRay's case, the elements, and have a look at what we've got. So we've got this extra texture, VRay Dirt, which will be our ambient occlusion. So there's an ambient occlusion pass. Next up will come in the GI. So this is the global illumination contribution of my lighting. Then next up will come the direct lighting. So this is direct lighting information. Okay, and let's see. Then we've got the reflection. So these are all the reflections in the room. And now we'll have refraction. Okay, so as you can see, we've got the refraction here. And what we've got, specular, which probably won't be a lot of. There you go, you just see some specular highlights here. And Z depth. So, it gets whiter towards the back, darker towards the front. And I'll show you how to utilize this Z depth within Photoshop in a second. So first things first, let's get rid of this image because, I'm getting quite a few tabs up here. And I'm just going to go through and convert all of these to 16-bit before I do anything else. So for each one, I'm just going to go exposure and gamma. Now you can spend some time even toning each individual element of the scene. That's what's nice, to break it down into these elements. Each one of these things can be individually tweaked. Well, let's just go to image adjustments, mode 16-bit. And exposure and gamma. Okay. It really doesn't matter if you merge or don't merge there, by the way, because there's only one layer. but you can't, however, press cancel because that just cancels the whole operation. There we go. And the Z depth I'll just knock down to 16-bit as well. Okay, so there we go. Right, let's have a look. So we need to start putting these back together. So let's start by layering them one on top of the other. So let's take our GI and just move it up to the dirt layer. It doesn't really matter which order you stack these in for right now. And now I've added the GI, I'm just going to close it. And now the direct lighting. Now the reflection. Now the refraction. Okay, it's gone, away you go. And now the specular. And the depth I'm going to use, the depth pass we did, I'm going to use in a Photoshop lens blur. So I don't want to drag that over the top of this image. I'm going to just get rid of the specular now I've used it. What I'm going to do is go Control A to select the whole thing, Control C, and I'm going to paste it into an alpha channel here. So I'm going to go New Channel, Alpha 1, and paste. Okay, so the Z depth that we created is now actually the alpha channel of this image. Alright, so what we've got here is, you know, fairly, let's see, let's just make sure we're on RGB here, not alpha. Yep, we are. What we've got here is, well, just basically the specular we can see at the moment. So where the blending mode is, change them all to screen. And you can see our image sort of come back to life here. Okay, the problem is now that of course I've changed this one to screen and then this one screens over the ambient occlusion, which we don't want. So leave the last one on normal. And what we're looking for is our GI. So it's this. Okay, because we want to multiply the ambient occlusion just over the GI. So let's move the ambient occlusion up here and click multiply. Okay, and then we can turn on the other layers like so, and you can see what contribution the ambient occlusion had. Okay, so you might want to turn the opacity down on that ambient occlusion a bit. I'll just knock it down to 30 for now. And then what we need to do is bring in an image for the background. So I'm just going to go and open up a photograph that I've got lying around. Okay, so I've opened that up in Photoshop, and as you can see, it's nothing very clever. I'll probably use a different one. I just happen to have this one, and it works fine for illustrating the point. Now I can drag this up to our shot here, and it's going to tell me that it's at a different quality and depth, but that's fine. I'll just click yes, and now I can drag it sort of into position, make sure it's the last level, and outside the window appears our background, and you'll notice through the curtains you can see the trees outside. So now I have a much greater degree of control of this image. You know, now I've got some ambient occlusion going on here. As I flick that backwards and forwards, and if I, you know, increase the effectiveness of it, you can see it come into play. I've got this, and you know, you should probably name these when you put them in so you can see what. This is the direct lighting contribution. So if I were to just adjustments now and levels, you know, I'll play with just where the direct lighting contribution was. So all of this gives me a pretty fantastic level of control over this image. Let's see what we've got here. Reflections, for instance, if we wanted to increase the intensity of our reflections, again, just come up to the levels here, and you know, I can make them disappear completely, or I can bang the white down and I can get much stronger reflective surfaces. Okay, so splitting these up into these elements has allowed us a much bigger degree of freedom than we would normally experience, and it really hasn't taken that much longer to render. So at the moment I'm just going to deal with this refraction because we've got too much of it. It's one laid on top of the other and I don't really like it. So I'm just going to adjustments, levels, and I'm just going to kick it out a bit. There we go. Again, this is something you're going to want to spend some time on, but unlike Maya, where you're going to have to wait 12, 20 minutes, however long your test renders are taking, this is instant feedback. So this is, pretty funky to play around with. You could start grabbing stuff and changing colors. For instance, let's change the color on the primary light stack. Okay, now I can tint the whole scene a variety of hues where the direct light has fallen, so I can get all sorts of effects right now. I'm going to leave that to you. I just wanted to show you how to bring all these render elements in and kind of stack them together. And I can see here that I've got some problems with this edge of this curtain. So I can actually come in and start turning things off and finding out what's causing that problem. So I can see that what's causing that problem is the direct illumination in the scene, which means that if I go to Maya and take a look at my direct illumination, which is directional light here, and a look at its shadows, it has comparatively few shadow rays at 16, so I could try increasing that, and that would probably fix this problem for me here. So, saving out these elements also can be a great boon when it comes to troubleshooting a problem as well. Again, it's not really the primary reason, but it certainly doesn't hurt that you can use it for that. Okay, so now I've got this image, and you know what? I'm going to just finish it off with a very simple compositing technique. So let's just duplicate this layer. I'm going to just move it out by this window here. There we go. There shouldn't be any transparency here. I was just worried it might have caught the edge of the curtain, so it's better to have something there. Alright, and then I'll get this one and just move it, whoops, wrong one, this one, and just kind of get this background that I like. And what I would personally do now, as soon as I've finished, tweaking any layers that I might need to tweak, I normally just merge the image. Okay, now I've got just one standard image. I can't move the background layer anymore. I can't tweak any of the individual elements. I wouldn't do this until you're happy with it. But one of the things I like to put in is just a contrast S-curve. So if you bring up a curves adjustment layer and just pull down the blacks a little bit and push up the whites a little bit in an S-shaped pattern, this will create a much more generally dynamic look to your image. Okay, and from here you can basically do any of the post-production compositing that takes your fancy. Now, I use I'll just bring it up, a system called Magic Bullet sometimes, which is just a color grading and correction tool that will allow you to add quick color grades over the top of your image. So what we've done there is color graded a white box, so let's just kill this a second. There we go. Hang on, cancel. Sorry, that just took a while. So obviously you're going to want to be selected on this image, and I'm also going to duplicate this image just in case we get something wrong or we need to dim the effect of this. But this is by a company called Red Giant. A great little piece of kit. I use it all the time. So, all of this you can do in Photoshop by hand. But this just lets you flick through a few ideas. So take this one for instance. It's a color grade that would be used according to this on a blockbuster movie. So let's just hit finish. And give it a second, and that's there. But because we have it as a separate layer, we can whap down the opacity to get less of the effect. Okay, so there it is, without, with. So I use these things sometimes, particularly the biggest one I use is this magic bullet, just to give it a tiny bit of a kick. It isn't necessary for you to run out and buy it. You can create the effect yourself in Photoshop. In fact, you know, if we just go into Photoshop and go image, adjustments, let's get this one, and use a simple photo filter, even depending on the effect that you're going for. So you could try a kind of cooling filter on here and preview that. So again, the effect is not dissimilar. Basically, it's just Magic Bullet gives you a few presets to work with. Sorry, not Magic Bullet. Where am I? Magic Bullet looks. So, you know, I'm going to leave you for the post-production in this. Oh, and one thing I forgot before I go, sorry, I'm going slightly mad. We forgot the depth of field. So, you know, let's do a zoom in here. And I'm going to turn the curves off and the filter there. Okay, just so I can do a quick comparison. Okay, I think I'll probably just maybe not use the curves in this particular instance. I always do like a contrast S-curve. It normally does kick the image up a bit, but in this case, no. Alright, so now let's say I'm happy with my image. I've done most of my post work and, you know, everything's looking good, but I want depth of field. Well, if we look, we've still got that alpha channel, you know, which we're going to use as depth of field, and I'll show you why in a second. So let's just flatten this. Now we're happy. Image, sorry, layer, merge visible. There we go. And filter, blur. I'm going to use a lens blur. And if you'll notice, I've got this thing called blur focal distance here, which is generally set to none. But if I've got an alpha channel, and that alpha channel happens to have a depth mask in it, I can now use the blur distance to adjust the depth of field. And the easiest way to see this is if I crank up this noise, you see everywhere is noisy, which means everywhere is blurry. But if I, in fact, I want to invert my my depth map as well. So if I move this, you should see some areas start to become clear. Okay, and I'm getting a clear area at the back there, but that's not where I want it. So sometimes this takes a little fiddliness. Okay, let me just try this on a non-inverted map. Ah, there we go, perfect. Sorry, you don't need to invert it. Okay, so let's have a look. Everywhere with none of this grain on, so just keep pulling this until you get where you want. So this is now going to be in focus, and the heavier the grain here, the more it's going to be blurred. So if we just turn that grain off, because I'm just using it as a preview, you can see in the back here we're pretty blurred, this background went pretty blurred, and in fact if we change the blur radius, you'll get an even more kind of extreme blur. Okay, so now we've gone, you'll have to give it a second, so now we've gone really blurred back here, but this front shot is still very much in focus, which is what the noise tells us here. Okay, and you know, that's pretty good. You can go up to more accurate or faster. I generally have it set to faster when I'm pulling it about and changing blur, focal distance and stuff. Okay, no, I actually quite like that where it was before. And let's bring the noise back just so I can double check where that's going to be. And maybe a little bit more. And as you can see, this is a really, really easy way to play around with depth of field. Okay, and I'm going to turn this blur radius down. It's a good idea to turn the blur radius down to sort of 1 while you're doing the tweaking, because that will let you move this about a bit quicker. Okay. And and so we're going to hit a sweet spot around here, and a sweet spot for me where I want my focus, which is predominantly here, and as we go further back, very blurry. So right now I can turn the noise off, the radius up, and just wait for this to generate, depending on how much depth of field I want. Probably not that much. It's still a bit blurry along the back there. Still a bit. Okay, let's call that good. So there you go. There is some added depth of field as well. Okay, so I hope you found something in this tutorial, and we kind of had a crash course in VRay, which is what I wanted to do from the start. Rather than trying to concentrate on any individual area of VRay, I just wanted to run through everything from some of the basic materials, some of the basic settings, and how to do a basic composite in Photoshop. So I hope you found that interesting, and if you have any questions, you can always email me at david@SimplyMaya, or you can grab me over at the SimplyMaya forum. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Now, we have a more advanced VRay tutorial upcoming, which will probably be out sometime next month, although if you want to see that a bit faster, you can always write to me and I can prioritize it if enough people hopefully enjoyed this one. So again, thank you very much for watching, and as I said, you get me, David at SimplyMaya. Cheers. Hi, welcome back. Now, I thought I'd take the time to record one last part for this tutorial, and it's somewhat of a bonus part. When I looked at the render I did for VRay, I realized I had some volumetric lighting within that render. So I thought it'd only be fair to cover the process of getting this volumetric lighting within VRay. So as you can see, here's our main light coming from our window over here, and here's some volume light effects. So if we compare this one, which I've now pretty much finished the post work on in Photoshop, with a raw render that came out of VRay, you can see that volume light makes a subtle, but I think in this case, nice contribution to the render. So there's the raw render, and there's the one with some volume light and with that depth of field applied and some slight color corrections. So I'm just going to take a minute to finish off this tutorial finally with how to create a volumetric lighting pass within VRay. So this is our scene as we left it. Now I haven't really done anything to it, and all I want to do is take a volume pass with this light. So I want that light fog. Now it's a very bad idea to render your light fog over the top of your main image, because if I take this fog pass as it was, so I've just slightly corrected it there, so there's the raw fog pass out of VRay, and I make sure this is a 16-bit image. There we go. And I then actually, I'm going to need to make sure that this raw render is a 16-bit image as well. So we'll just go up to mode and 16 bits. Okay, and again, I'll just put this onto exposure and gamma, click OK. Now, this is what would happen if I rendered the fog pass over the main image. So I'll just pop these two together and screen the fog pass. So if I'd have just put the fog pass on over the top of the main image and hit render, this is what I would have gotten. And as you can see, it's too much. So then we're left to render again and adjust the opacity of the fog pass, play with the settings of the fog pass, and basically, with these translucent transparent curtains in here, this scene takes quite a while to render. So you'd end up with a situation where you'd be doing lots of renders just to get this volume pass right. And as you can see, within Photoshop, I have much more control over this contribution of this volume fog. I can kind of adjust its levels and whatnot. So it's a much better idea to do this on a separate layer as opposed to try and rendering it along with your main image. So if we go into Maya, I'm going to use a render layer. Now, before we've used the display layer just to turn things on and off in the room. This time we're going to use a render layer. And what we want in this render layer is basically everything we have in the scene. So I'm just going to shift select this lot, and then I'm going to shift select the directional light, because that's the light we want the fog from. Okay, and since the last part I've introduced a couple of light switches here. I'll save those out as part of the final scene, so you can kind of put those in your scene as well. And I'm going to need those back curtains. So when I've got everything selected, including my main light, I can come up to here, just like with the display layers, and create a new layer and assign those selected objects. So now I've got everything in this layer 1, which we'll call fog, apart from my portal lights, which really wouldn't make much difference in this case. Okay, so now we've got that basically set up. We don't want to render this out in color. We don't want to render it with the translucency, the transparency. We don't want to render the textures. We want to get this render as fast as possible. So I'm going to right click on here and go to overrides. Then I'm going to go to create new material override. And I'm just going to assign a standard Lambert. I don't need a VRay material for this. A Lambert will be absolutely fine. And then I'm just going to go into the material properties of that Lambert, and I'm going to make it black. I'm also going to come down to its opacity settings and change that to black hole. That means we'll get a correct alpha channel with this should we need it. Okay, so that's basically the scene set up. Now we just need to introduce a little bit of fog. So if we just come up to our VRay settings and hit use environment volume, I can then click here, the little swatch box, which will bring up our create node. And if I type fog in here, you'll see a VRay environment fog. So we'll click on this VRay environment fog. Okay, and if we click this square with the arrow, you'll get the environment fog settings. So that's basically it. If I render now, what you'll see, and I'll just put my test resolution down to say 50%, what you'll see is actually just blackness, and we'll need to adjust some settings in here, but I'll just take one so you can see a quick before and after. Okay, as I said, just blackness. This has to do with the fog distance. Now we know from measuring our depth of field that our scene is about 1200 units from front to back. So we'll set that fog distance to maybe a little bit further than that. We'll set it to 1500. Okay, so now we should have the right scale. So let's just click go, and this time you should see some light fog. Now you'll see here that our fog looks a bit clipped off at the top. This is because our fog height here is set to 100 units and our room is about 3.5 meters high. So we'd need to set that for say 400, and I'll render again, and then you should see the proper variation in the fog. Okay, so there's a render with the fog height at 400, and you see in this proper variation in the fog, it's not kind of truncated at 100 units up the scene, so it's looking a lot better. Now we can increase the quality of this with the subdivs. We can also scatter it through the GI, which I normally do. So let's just go a couple of hundred GI scatter bounces, which will obviously take a bit longer to render. The other thing I don't like about this is how white this or how light this back window plane is appearing. So in order to fix that, I'm just going to use a polyplane, and I'll make it a little larger, and I'll bring it out, and I'm just going to cover up that doorway. It's a bit of a cheat, but it gives me the effect I'm looking for. Okay. Now you don't want to bisect the geometry, you just want to sort of push it out a little bit. There we go, just so we're covering up that back doorway. Okay, that should do it. And I've got a bookmark camera view that I've been using. So now we should have all our ducks in a row. Let's take a look at our environment fog, which you can find in the outliner, or you can find by just clicking this here. So I've got the correct fog distance, I've got the correct fog height. My subdivs are on 8, which will mean my fog is quite grainy, but you know, I actually like my fog quite grainy, and pretty much that's all I need to change. So if I do a render now, I should get the correct fog pass. and it will take a tad longer because of the scatter GI. Now you can go ahead and crank the quality and play with the height and distance depending on your scene size, of course. If you are not actually following along with the same room that I'm doing and you're doing your own, then you'll need to get these units in the right ballpark. And that's basically it. And even with the scatter GI turned on, we're only looking at 2 minutes. So you can do a very, very fast volume fog pass. Now, obviously, if you turn up the quality with the sub-divs, that's going to take a bit longer. But, you know, all you need to do now is just save out this image, which for something like this can just be done with save image straight from the render view. Bring it into your Photoshop and just screen it over the top of your image, and you'll get this volume fog. Okay, the slight volumetric light effect, which I have used in the final image here. So apologies for making this a bonus part, but I simply overlooked it during the planning of the original tutorial, and I hope that helps you if you want to get volumetric lighting into a scene. Now, as I said at the end of the last part, if you want to ask me any questions, Dave at SimplyMaya, or just post one on the forum. We get a lot of helpful people in there, and I'm sure somebody will be happy to point you in the right direction. Alright, so thanks for watching. Cheers.